Our protagonist grew up in a family that, while not wealthy, was always overflowing with warmth. Her father was a dedicated man who gave his all for the family, while her mother always trusted and relied on him. Beneath them were her and her younger brother, both growing up in the complete love of their parents. However, there was one problem that no amount of love could compensate for. She was born far too shy. Her timidness caused her peers to call her a scary freak, while adults criticized her for having no courage at all. Socializing was so difficult that after school every day, her only joy was sitting in front of the TV. And on that small screen, the little girl found her ideal role models, a top South Korean actor couple who had everything from talent and glamour to a perfect love. When asked about their current lives, the happy couple shared that they were busy raising their first child. The actress smiled proudly, revealing her son's name was Seo Ki-hyeon, and affectionately asked if it wasn't a very beautiful name. The husband chimed in, praising that the boy was as beautiful as his name, so much so that he was often mistaken for a girl when he was younger. And then, the television program began introducing the daily life of Seo Ki-hyeon, the son of the famous actor couple. The moment he appeared on screen with wavy purple hair and a charming smile, a whole new world opened up before her eyes. The girl froze, her heart nearly skipping a beat, letting out a wow of admiration as the boy seemed to be greeting her through the screen. That was indeed Seo Ki-hyeon, who inherited all the finest traits from his parents. For the little girl, this was the first time she had seen a peer appear on TV, so different from the usual older guests. Perhaps because of that, instead of noisy adult variety shows, she was completely captivated by this boy's life. Her eyes were glued to the screen, following every moment even though they weren't particularly funny or special. She wondered why, at the same age, that boy could be so mature and calm. If only she were beautiful too. If only she could make friends easily and never feel out of place in a crowd like him. But then the fantasy shattered, and reality abruptly pulled her back when she encountered two classmates and coldly asked what they were doing. Even knowing that a sparrow cannot soar with a phoenix, she still couldn't stop herself from giving a forced smile, thinking it looked fun. The reaction of her two friends was utter confusion, as they stammered, asking what was wrong with her. When she pressed them if they had anything to say, they hurriedly denied it, leaving the girl bewildered, wondering why it was so strange, since she had mimicked Ki-hyeon exactly. Back home, her father caught his daughter staring at the TV again and asked if she was watching Ki-hyeon, while her younger brother yelled that his sister wouldn't let him watch action movies. The mother smiled, remarking that the daughter was just like her father. Once they liked something, they couldn't let go, and the father turned to ask if she really liked Ki-hyeon that much. The girl's eyes lit up, affirming that she liked him very, very much, then excitedly bragged that Ki-hyeon could already speak high school-level English, which was incredible. She also went on about Ki-hyeon hosting a birthday party with 28 friends invited, making her father laugh and acknowledge that the boy was truly a young scholar. To soothe his son, the father promised to buy new toys if he let his sister have the TV, while the mother gently reminded her daughter to sit back so as not to hurt her eyes. Public admiration grew, and Seo Ki-hyeon's family went from occasional guests to fixed faces on the program. Thanks to that, she saw Ki-hyeon more often and his fame grew day by day. But then at some point, everything changed. But one day, the girl sat disappointed before a blank screen, turning to ask her father if her idol Ki-hyeon wouldn't appear today either. The father could only pat her head in comfort, guessing that perhaps because Ki-hyeon had become too famous, his schedule was busier than before. However, that comfort seemed to backfire as the girl pouted, secretly thinking she didn't like him becoming famous at all. During one dinner, the family atmosphere suddenly felt different when Do-young wondered why her father hadn't been turning on the news, as usual lately. The father laughed awkwardly, making the excuse of being tired, while the mother seemed tense, merely uttering Ki-hyeon's name with hidden meaning. It turned out that to hide a certain truth, the parents had been continuously replaying old episodes of Ki-hyeon, to the point where the girl knew every line and every narration by heart. Suddenly one day at school, a blood-curdling scream echoed through the hallway. A classmate was sobbing uncontrollably, while the boy standing with her pointed at Do-young and insisted to the teacher that she was the one who made Jisoo cry. The teacher didn't listen to explanations, only sternly reminding Do-young not to bully friends and to learn how to socialize, leaving the girl stunned, stammering that the truth wasn't like that. Sitting alone on a cold swing, the girl painfully wondered, I only accidentally walked up from behind. Could I really look that scary? In her desperation, the girl could only wonder, if it were Ki-hyeon, what would he do in this situation? Heavy sadness etched onto her young face. The girl was completely submerged in loneliness. But then a determination sparked. She realized she had to go meet Ki-hyeon. She needed a friend like him. And so, that elementary school girl, relying on the neighborhood and school information she had memorized from TV, stood up. Without a moment's hesitation, she set off, determined to find the only light of her life. She was certain that Ki-hyeon would understand her feelings and smile at her, because he was completely different. A fierce hope burned in her heart that just by being close to him, her life would turn a new page. However, the moment she arrived, her eyes suddenly swirled in utter confusion. Standing frozen in the middle of a strange road, the girl stammered, not understanding what was happening. This scene was nothing like what was on TV. And then, a sense of horror enveloped her, cold sweat pouring down as a terrifying truth gradually revealed itself. The harsh truth hit. The little girl was completely lost, standing alone in the middle of a strange street. Panicked, the girl ran headlong without noticing a car rushing toward her. A piercing car horn blared, her eyes widening in horror at the imminent danger. The sound of screeching brakes erupted, and the shiny black car stopped just centimeters away from her. The driver angrily leaned out of the window, loudly scolding her for recklessly rushing into the street. The girl's entire body trembled violently, tears on the verge of overflowing as the man's shouting rang in her ears, saying she had almost been hit. The shock passed, and the girl was left trudging alone on the deserted road, sobbing and sniffing as she went. In her despair, the girl let out a sob, unconsciously calling for her father. But then she froze, a strange thought flashing through her mind. That was not her voice. The sound seemed to come from a small, dark alley nearby, and she curiously peeked inside. Do-young curiously poked her head into the dark corner of the alley, where the sound of melancholy sobbing was coming from. The girl's eyes widened when she recognized a familiar figure huddled in the darkness. It was Ki-hyeon, her longtime perfect idol, now bowing his head and sobbing with a pathetic expression. He looked up at her with soulless eyes, dark circles and exhaustion covering his beautiful face. Without a care for the abnormality of it all, Do-young was overjoyed and said she had finally found him. Casting aside all her innate shyness, the little girl excitedly introduced herself as Chae Do-young. She expressed that she had always watched him on television and truly loved him. But in contrast to his warm image on screen, Ki-hyeon's gaze suddenly became sharp and full of hatred. When she offered to be friends, he responded with a cold curse, asking what the hell she was doing there. Do-young stood frozen, her heart shattering as she realized her idol was nothing like what she had dreamed of. Ki-hyeon clutched his head in agony, repeatedly saying that he didn't want to do those broadcasts ever again. He screamed in Do-young's face that he didn't want to be friends with anyone, and forbade her from calling his name so familiarly as if they had known each other for a long time. A burst of anger erupted. He ranted that it was because of those recordings that weird kids kept following him, then shouted that he hated everything. The boy ran away, not forgetting to leave behind a desperate plea to be left alone. Do-young stood motionless, her face in shock as if she couldn't believe what she had just heard. The first emotion the person she once admired with all her heart felt for her was not understanding, but utter loathing. In the middle of the dark night, a man's voice calling Do-young's name rang out, filled with worry and urgency. It was her father, frantically running everywhere, his face drenched in sweat and tears at the loss of his little daughter. He looked around wildly with bloodshot eyes, his breath shallow with the fear that the worst might have happened. Meanwhile, Do-young walked slowly and alone on the empty road, her soul now seemingly closed off after the massive shock. In the middle of the cold night street, the father frantically called his little daughter's name when he finally found her standing dazed. But Do-young just stood there like a soulless corpse, her empty eyes looking toward her father without any reaction. Long-suppressed emotions suddenly burst into sobbing. The girl choked out her father's name in infinite resentment. The father's warm arms enveloped her. He gently comforted her, saying everything was okay now and urged her to return home. However, The emotional wound from that horrific encounter was etched deeper into the girl's mind than any other memory, a supreme obsession that she would likely have to carry as a burden for the rest of her life. Years passed, and the neatly hung high school uniform marked a challenging new chapter in Do-young's life. Already shy, she became even more reserved after that incident and decided to lock the door to her heart, no longer having enough courage to speak to anyone. The girl told herself that proactively staying away so as not to make others feel uncomfortable was the kindest thing she could do right now. And when she received her first phone, the girl secretly hoped that this colorful virtual world would help her feel a bit less lonely. Do-young held the phone, accidentally touching a dark region of memory she had sworn never to dig up again. But a fierce curiosity arose, making her unable to resist searching for information about her old friend on the screen. The harsh truth appeared as the press exposed Ki-hyeon's father's affair, shattering the image of the model husband. The tragedy reached its climax with news headlines confirming that Shin Go-eun had taken her own life at home because she could not bear it any longer. The girl realized with shock that she was the only naive one who knew nothing about the storm that had wiped out her idol's family. Only now did she understand why her father always tried to avoid the news and only replayed old episodes to protect her soul. Moving through the cold wind, Do-young silently thanked her parents' protection and sent a sincere wish that the boy from years ago was now happy. A long breath exhaled into the air. She tried to brush away the lingering sadness to continue on the path ahead. At that very moment, a figure with purple hair brushed past her, bringing a sense of familiarity that made her shiver. Her eyes widened in shock, her breath hitching before a fateful encounter she had never dared to think of. Do-young turned around abruptly, her heart pounding as a familiar silhouette brushed past in a fateful moment. Ahead was a student couple walking briskly, and that distinctive purple hair was unmistakable. The teenage boy flashed a radiant smile at his companion, his past beauty now more mature and captivating than ever. Do-young stood frozen in shock, secretly fearing whether he still carried that terrible loathing from the past. She hurriedly hid behind a pillar, holding her breath while observing Ki-hyeon chatting with a girl about not wanting to go to private academy today. Seeing his slightly tired face as he admitted to being distracted by some matters yesterday, Do-young felt her chest tighten. The boy suddenly stopped and turned his head as if sensing eyes secretly watching him from behind. Contrary to his previous smile, Ki-hyeon's gaze now became sharp and dark, recalling the horrific nightmare in the alley years ago. Do-young was stunned, her breath caught in the air thick with tension while facing that terrifying coldness. She could only utter a broken call of the name of the person she both longed to see and feared incessantly. Do-young softly called Ki-hyeon's name, but the call seemed to vanish into thin air before the receding back. The boy walked on casually beside his classmate, smiling and saying he hadn't left anything behind. Standing silent in the street, she bitterly realized that in his mind, her existence had been completely erased. Though her heart constricted, she reassured herself that his remembering nothing of that painful past was truly for the best. Looking at his radiant smile now, she felt relieved to witness her former idol having found true happiness. The small dream of being by his side and sharing with him finally vanished like smoke, leaving her alone. But she had no regrets, for just seeing him living well was enough to close her long-held thoughts. She quietly turned and walked away, shedding the burden of obsession to find peace for her soul. She told herself this would be the last time they met, a gentle full stop to the strange fate from their childhood. However, an unexpected event occurred that left Do-young aghast, cold sweat pouring as she wondered what on earth was happening before her eyes. Do-young looked sideways in shock and wondered if this was a dream as the idol Ki-hyeon was sitting right next to her. The alarm clock rang piercingly at 7:30 a.m., ruthlessly tearing apart the sweet, budding illusion. A hand reached out to silence the noisy sound, pulling the young woman back to the dry reality of a new day beginning. Standing silent in her room, the adult Do-young looked at her phone with sorrowful eyes, seemingly unable to escape the lingering echoes of the dream. Her mother's voice from downstairs, gently reminding her to come down for breakfast, couldn't make that expressionless face brighten up at all. During the meal, her father worriedly asked if her school skirt was too short, and she calmly explained it was because she had just grown taller. Suddenly, Her father burst into tears of emotion, lamenting that his daughter was growing up too fast and had truly become a beautiful young lady. Ignoring her father's sobbing with worry about the day she would leave the family's embrace, Do-young coldly commented that today's soup was too salty. Leaving the modern apartment complex, she left behind her parents' somewhat excessive protection to face the world alone. Standing before the new school, fear from the past rushed back, making her wonder how she could integrate here once again. Do-young walked through the school hallways, hearing faint whispers from peers and only secretly praying her new seatmate would be a quiet person to ease her pressure. A sharp pain in her stomach from excessive stress made her clutch her body, trembling as she watched groups of students buzzing about a certain special character. She froze before the classroom door, bewilderedly wondering why so many people were gathered here, making the space feel suffocating and awkward. The cold fluorescent lights on the ceiling seemed to pierce deeper into the loneliness and alienation of the young girl in the strange school. Lacking the courage to squeeze through the crowd, Do-young chose to flee into the restroom, huddling on the toilet lid and secretly wishing for the class bell to ring soon. Finally, the bell signaling the start of class echoed through the hallways, releasing her from her voluntary imprisonment in the dark. Stepping into the classroom with relief for having bypassed the crowd, she suddenly encountered a tall figure walking out right at the door. A slight collision at the shoulder startled Do-young, her heart suddenly racing at this unexpected contact. The young man quickly apologized and kindly asked if she was okay, leaving Do-young only able to stammer back that she was fine in utter confusion. However, when she saw the face of the person opposite her clearly, her eyes widened in horror as she realized ironic fate had brought the one she feared right before her. Seo Ki-hyeon smiled gently, saying he was very happy, his perfect beauty making the surrounding atmosphere suddenly feel ethereal. Standing paralyzed at the classroom door, Do-young wondered in shock if this was a cruel dream playing tricks on her mind. She rubbed her eyes vigorously, trying to deny the presence of the person she longed to escape from the shadows of the past. Her face distorted in horror as she realized this breath and racing pulse were evidence of an inescapable reality. While Do-young was lost, the surrounding classmates were buzzing in admiration of the famous rookie's outstanding height. The boy interacted casually with everyone, completely overshadowing the existence of the girl standing trembling in the distance. The atmosphere in the classroom suddenly became solemn as the teacher's roll call rang out, slowly approaching the fateful name. Ki-hyeon raised his hand to confirm his presence with a confident demeanor, causing the room to shake once more with cheers. Hiding behind the door, Do-young shuddered to confirm once again that the name Seo Ki-hyeon just called out was absolutely real. The story became even more breathless when the teacher suddenly announced a change in the seating chart to create opportunities for everyone to make new friends. Do-young nervously reached her hand into the drawing box while the teacher asked in a stern voice who was making noise in the back. She burst into joy upon drawing the long-desired window seat. Just one more quiet seatmate, and her school life would truly be peaceful. Suddenly, a chill ran down her spine, making her turn pale as she wondered if fate could be so cruel as to seat Ki-hyeon next to her. She tried to brush away that crazy thought, reassuring herself that such a far-fetched thing could absolutely not happen. However, a tall figure suddenly stood before the desk and coldly announced that this was his seat. Before her eyes was Ki-hyeon's unrealistically beautiful face, his lips curling slightly as he offered a polite greeting. Do-young's mind completely froze as she heard the teacher calling other students' names, while her entire body shook from overload. A female student sitting right in front excitedly remarked how lucky she was to still be near Ki-hyeon, putting Do-young in an awkward position. She stole a sideways glance, quietly observing the masculine changes in her childhood friend, who was now so different from before. Ki-hyeon still possessed the same ethereal beauty as years ago, but now his facial features had become much sharper and more defined. Do-young blushed in embarrassment, realizing her old friend was not only handsome but also possessed a height far exceeding her memory. However, a sudden feeling of insecurity invaded her mind, making her stop to reflect. Her eyes were fixed on the female classmate flashing a radiant smile next to Ki-hyeon, wondering how close the relationship between them truly was. A faint fragment of memory from middle school suddenly returned. She recognized this was the girl who had been with him during that brief encounter years ago. Suddenly, that girl turned to look directly at Do-young and curiously asked what her name was, making the atmosphere become extremely tense. Do-young panicked, pointing at herself, stammering as she tried to utter the name that had been buried deep in her heart for so long. The image of the innocent little girl from the past excitedly introducing herself as Chae Do-young suddenly returned like a knife twisting into an old wound. Her face turned pale, cold sweat pouring down as the horrific obsession with her idol's loathing once again surrounded her reality. Unable to bear the massive psychological pressure, Do-young collapsed onto her desk to everyone's surprise, ending the encounter with a dramatic fainting spell. The teacher concluded the first orientation session, telling the class to work hard together and always listen to his instructions. Do-young stole a glance at the friend beside her, silently telling herself that break time was the moment to regain her composure. As soon as the teacher's silhouette vanished behind the door, the silent space was suddenly shattered by noise. A crowd of passionate female students rushed in like a whirlwind, repeatedly calling Ki-hyeon's name with faces full of admiration. A series of questions about the teenage boy's private life and fame began pouring down, surrounding the desks of both of them. Do-young, sitting right next to him, suddenly felt suffocated by the unintentional collisions, silently screaming inside that she was very scared. Contrary to the little girl's panic, Ki-hyeon maintained a terrifying calm despite being at the center of the chaos. The teenage boy casually showed off his perfect profile, his cold face looking as though he was all too familiar with the spotlight surrounding him. The feeling of lonely alienation once again occupied Do-young's mind, making her only able to hang her head in gloom. She withdrew into herself amidst the surrounding strangers, realizing that her presence beside him was no different from a grain of dust among millions of stars. Do-young quietly stood up to leave her seat, her ears feeling muffled as she heard the laughter and the proud confession from a female student saying she was a longtime fan of Ki-hyeon. She bitterly realized that everyone saw his remarkable growth, while she only saw an invisible wall of separation that was growing larger. Watching Ki-hyeon surrounded by the adoring crowd, Do-young sourly admitted that she had never been the only one secretly supporting him. The image of the innocent little girl from the past returned as a cruel reminder. What right did she have to hope for a special place in his heart? The natural behavior of the classmates around Ki-hyeon made her feel even more humiliated by her own extreme shyness. She bowed her head in avoidance, her heart tightening as she automatically assumed she was the only misfit who didn't belong to that teenage boy's radiant world. Despite having been hurt, she still chose to believe the warm version on TV was his true self, trying to dispel the ghosts of the past. A faint smile of contentment appeared. Do-young reassured herself that being his seatmate was already luck far beyond what she deserved. Subdued sadness once again covered her delicate face. She decided to retreat into her shell to protect the last bit of self-respect remaining. Amidst the classroom full of laughter, Do-young resignedly began a new school year in the shadows, accepting her role as an outsider in Seo Ki-hyeon's life. Do-young accidentally dropped her pen on the floor, a small mishap that made her gasp in surprise. Her eyes watched in horror as the pen rolled toward Ki-hyeon's feet, silently screaming why it chose that exact direction. While Ki-hyeon remained motionless, Do-young had to force herself to lean down to pick up the item despite her heart being full of fear. The young girl's face was extremely tense, sweat breaking out as she faced the ironic situation right next to her idol. She made herself small under the desk, holding her breath and reaching out her hand in a desperate effort not to draw any attention. Do-young worriedly told herself that with such a close distance, he would surely have a reason to notice her presence. She peeked her eyes upward, nervously waiting for a reaction from the boy sitting right next to her. Ki-hyeon still kept a face as cold as ice, his hand supporting his chin with arrogance, radiating an atmosphere so dark it was suffocating. Do-young was stunned, her breath halting as she caught that soulless expression and wondered what was truly going on. The terrifying silence was broken when the teacher looked up to ask what was happening in the back, pushing attention to its peak. Ki-hyeon quickly waved his hand to deny the teacher's suspicion and casually said that he had just dropped his pen. Under the desk, Do-young was huddling in confusion while the teenage boy casually leaned down. He gently returned the pen to her with a short confirmation. Ki-hyeon curled his lips into a slight smile, gently telling her that next time if there was anything, she should feel free to ask for his help. Taking the item with a stammered thank you, Do-young breathed a silent sigh of relief and believed the earlier coldness was just her being oversensitive. The pen now sat quietly on her desk at home, bringing with it a wave of completely new emotions. Do-young stood dazed with a blushing face, her heart beginning to race because of the caring gestures of her seatmate. The notification that her father had returned home suddenly rang out, pulling the young girl back to the peaceful reality of her family. The father could not hide his joy, excitedly calling his daughter's name the moment he stepped through the door to show off the gift he brought back. He affectionately handed her a box of cookies and reminded her that she used to want them very much, making the happiness in Do-young's heart seem to double. Touching the secret cookie box, the father softly told his daughter absolutely not to let her younger brother Do-jin know about this. Do-young excitedly cherished the gift in her hands, her eyes sparkling with hope as she asked her father if all of this was truly just for her. The father laughed kindly, affirming that his daughter needed to eat more because she looked a bit thin compared to peers her age. Meanwhile, at school, Ki-hyeon not only made a strong impression on his classmates, but also became the idol of the entire grade. Whether in sports competitions or academics, that teenage boy was always radiant and received passionate admiration from everyone around. Sitting pensively at her desk, Do-young silently felt the kindness and sincere warmth radiating from Ki-hyeon whenever she had the chance to be in close contact with him. The young girl carefully wrote each line of a letter, wondering if, after all those years, an apology for what happened in the past could help her receive forgiveness. Starting the letter with hesitation, she introduced herself as Chae Do-young, the seatmate carrying a heavy heart that had yet to be expressed. Memories returned as she confessed that she had once been a loyal fan, always considering watching his program the greatest joy after school. Do-young painfully admitted in her handwritten lines that years ago, it was her thoughtless actions that unintentionally left the deepest scar in his heart. Do-young sobbed as she embraced the pain, blaming her past self for being too naive and unintentionally placing heavy pressure on her loved one without realizing it. She held the pen carefully, writing each word on the paper, choked up as she sent a belated apology to Ki-hyeon, something she had yearned to say for so many years. And even if time changed everything, she still wanted him to understand that she was still silently watching and supporting him just as she did at the beginning. Do-young's eyes secretly observed the boy beside her, thinking that no matter how many people cared about him, the fact that they became seatmates was a strange destiny. Her gaze stopped at the bright red gift placed neatly in the desk drawer, silently sending a hope for a good new school year beside Ki-hyeon. However, her face suddenly changed color, her eyes tearing up with worry as self-doubt and past fears once again surrounded her mind. She sat motionless like a stone statue, bitterly watching Ki-hyeon happily chatting with another female friend without finding a suitable time to give the gift. That beautiful friend suddenly froze as if sensing a killing intent, letting out a suspicious cry when she caught Do-young's strange gaze. Then she smiled suggestively, publicly asking Do-young in front of the crowd if she had something she wanted to say to the male god Ki-hyeon. Do-young panicked and clenched her hands, cold sweat pouring down as the opportunity to face him came so suddenly that she fell completely into a passive state and couldn't react in time. Do-young stared at the bright red gift in the desk drawer with trembling hands, secretly fearing that if it was a now, she would never find a suitable time to express her heart. Overcoming her extreme fear, she suddenly stood up and thrust the gift box in front of Ki-hyeon, sobbing and shouting loudly that this was her sincere feelings for him all along. Do-young closed her eyes tightly, waiting in extreme shame, her face flushing red after gathering all her courage to carry out a reckless confession right in the middle of class. However, the atmosphere suddenly became strangely silent, making the little girl bewildered, wondering why all the noise around her had abruptly vanished like that. When she peeked her eyes open, she realized dozens of eyes of her classmates were all fixed on the two of them because the attention for the male god Ki-hyeon was already too great. Horror filled Do-young's mind as she suddenly realized her recent action had turned her into the center of scrutiny, something she had never dared to prepare herself to face. A male student suddenly laughed loudly and asked Do-young directly if she was secretly in love with Ki-hyeon, leaving her frozen in shock. Mocking whispers began to rise from behind. They didn't even remember what her name was and ridiculed that she was essentially just an invisible person not worth bothering with. In the middle of the large classroom, Do-young sat dazed, clutching the gift, while enduring the laughter about her sudden confession being considered weird. All the curiosity finally focused on Ki-hyeon's cold, expressionless face, as the crowd began to excitedly ask if he would truly accept the gift from this insignificant girl or not. Do-young's face changed, cold sweat running down as she heard the teasing that if Ki-hyeon accepted the gift, the two would officially become a dating couple. The surrounding crowd began to cheer wildly, repeatedly forcing Ki-hyeon to agree to date the girl standing trembling with a lonely back in front of him. A feeling of guilt surged in Do-young's heart as she blamed herself for being too selfish, fearing that she had pushed Ki-hyeon into an extremely ironic situation. She panicked, not knowing what to do to save the situation, as the confusion clearly shown on her loved one's face made her heart tighten in pain. For someone who always feared the eyes of society like Do-young, the chaotic atmosphere and surrounding laughter were truly a cruel psychological torture. She sat motionless on her chair, feeling dizzy and her heart racing with fear, wanting to vanish immediately to escape this harsh reality. However, a mysterious smile suddenly appeared on the male god's face, as if he had made his own decision before the eyes of everyone. Ki-hyeon's large hand suddenly reached out, gently but firmly taking the gift box from the trembling hands of the little girl. He turned to ask his friends to stop and scolded them for making Do-young feel uncomfortable, making all the classmates disappointed because the teasing was cut short. Ki-hyeon looked at Do-young with a gaze gentler than ever, softly advising her not to worry too much because everyone was just joking, officially soothing her shattering heart. Do-young softly nodded to accept reality, saying she would take this seat as a fateful beginning. The whispers and mocking glares of her classmates vanished instantly thanks to a few brief words of defense from Ki-hyeon. The small girl's heart, which had been racing with fear, began to find peace before the calm demeanor of the boy beside her. A powerful emotion flickered in her heart, making Do-young realize this connection had gone far beyond the boundaries of ordinary admiration. In her eyes at that time, Ki-hyeon was as radiant and perfect as a god, even when he was smiling while giving a gift to another female student. The bustling atmosphere of school closed, giving way to an unusual silence inside her family's small kitchen. Do-young sat quietly at the dining table, while her father diligently peeled apples as a daily habit of caring for his daughter. Sudden tension arrived when her father looked up and asked if she had eaten all the cookies he gave her. The young girl awkwardly lied that she had shared and finished all the cookies with her friends at school and softly apologized to her father. Her father's eyes widened in shock, tremblingly uttering the word friends, as if he had just heard the most absurd thing in the world. The girl hesitantly confirmed the truth, making her father unable to hide his astonishment. He cheered excitedly upon learning that his daughter had finally found her first friends. The father enthusiastically interrogated her for information and even insisted on inviting them home so he could show off his skills by cooking spicy rice cakes for them. She walked silently on the street with a heavy heart because in reality, she still didn't have a single true friend. But since Ki-hyeon accepted the gift, she only then began to feel the definition of happiness. Entering the classroom with a gloomy face, she froze when witnessing the scene before her eyes. Ki-hyeon was sitting opposite and chatting very intimately with another girl named Jae-yeon. Jae-yeon's beautiful appearance and radiant smile made her heart tighten with envy. Hearing that the two of them had been childhood friends since they were little, she understood that the girl held an extremely special position. The gentle gaze and the smile that Ki-hyeon gave Jae-yeon were completely different from when he was with others. A heartbreaking question suddenly appeared in Do-young's mind. Did Ki-hyeon truly like that girl, or did he only find salvation from Jae-yeon right after abandoning her? During the darkest days of his life, when Ki-hyeon completely collapsed due to his family tragedy, there was someone who helped him pick up each piece of his soul. And ironically, the silent hero who helped him stand up after his fall turned out to be Jae-yeon, that female student with a radiant smile. Do-young tried to suppress the pain, telling herself she should feel relieved because at least by his side, he still had such a solid support. But the truth was she was being burned by the fire of jealousy, witnessing the position that originally belonged to her now being replaced by another. Rumors began to spread throughout the hallways. Every student in school insisted that the relationship between Ki-hyeon and Jae-yeon was definitely not simple friendship. They whispered about how the two had been closely attached since elementary school and that their secret dating was an obvious truth beyond debate. Amidst the gloom covering her mind, Do-young suddenly appeared looming behind a group of friends who were gossiping with a chillingly cold aura. A blood-curdling scream rang out, making the whole class turn to look as a female student started in terror before Do-young's expressionless and dark face right next to her. Ignoring the panic and the scrutinizing eyes around her, the young girl glided past like a ghost and casually uttered that she just needed to go wash her hands. Do-young softly apologized and then hurriedly slipped past her classmate, her mind still not over the shock of recent events. She walked lonely along the empty hallway, clearly feeling her own alienation amidst a school full of strange faces. Suddenly, Ji-yeon appeared with a sunny smile, intimately calling Do-young's name, making the small girl start and stop in surprise. When asked about her destination, she awkwardly replied that she had just left the restroom and was on her way back to class. An unexpected twist occurred when Ji-yeon suggested inviting her to buy snacks together because she felt going alone was boring, leaving Do-young stunned, not believing her ears. Carefully observing the other's appearance, she noticed Ji-yeon was not only beautiful, but even the atmosphere around her was extremely radiant. Do-young silently compared Ji-yeon's popularity with Ki-hyeon, wondering why such a perfect person would want to associate with an insignificant person like her. Without letting Do-young react in time, Ji-yeon proactively grabbed her hand and pulled her away excitedly, casting aside all barriers and inherent self-doubt. The school scene appeared brilliant under the blue sky, marking a moment that completely changed her usual lonely life. Ji-yeon smiled and handed her a can of coffee as thanks for coming along, making Do-young feel her heart light for the first time in a strange way. Do-young confusedly accepted the drink, stammering words of thanks, while Ji-yeon smiled and said this was a small gift she gave to every friend of hers. The word friends rang out, making the small girl's chest tighten, silently admiring the kindness and thoughtfulness to a suffocating degree of the person opposite her. She suddenly remembered the early days of being lost in class. Ji-yeon was the only one who proactively stepped closer and dispelled her loneliness. Looking at the coffee can in her hand, Do-young bitterly admitted that such a wonderful person completely deserved to be by Ki-hyeon's side. Self-doubt rose, making her hang her head, her soul once again sinking into dark gloom when seeing herself as just an insignificant person. She secretly observed Ji-yeon, who was casually enjoying the drink, her heart rising with curiosity mixed with envy about their true relationship. Realizing the unusual silence, Ji-yeon slightly turned her head with a worried gaze, looking toward Do-young to seek an answer. But in response was only the bright smile of her classmate, making the small girl even more confused before that overwhelming radiance. The tension reached its peak when Ji-yeon suddenly laughed heartily, while Do-young was trembling with a heart racing because of curiosity. And then she took all her courage to launch a shocking question, directly probing whether Ji-yeon was secretly dating Ki-hyeon or not. Do-young confusedly received the drink, stammering a thank you when Ji-yeon smiled and said that buying gifts for friends was her habit. The word friends rang out, making Do-young stunned. She silently admired the unexpected kindness and thoughtfulness of the person opposite her. She suddenly remembered the early days of being lost in class. Ji-yeon was the only one who proactively stepped closer and started a conversation with her. Feeling the warmth from the drink, Do-young silently understood why such a wonderful person like Ji-yeon could become the closest piece in Ki-hyeon's life. However, self-doubt suddenly rose, making the little girl feel suffocated, silently envying the radiance that she herself could never have. The two sat quietly together on the stone bench, each pursuing her own separate thoughts amidst the silent school space. Realizing the unusual silence, Ji-yeon slightly frowned in worry, directing her clear eyes toward Do-young as if seeking an answer. Do-young gathered all her courage and softly called her friend's name, her voice slightly trembling but her eyes containing a rare seriousness. The tension was suddenly relieved by Ji-yeon's clear laughter. The friend casually joked around, making Do-young even more nervous. And then the little girl took all her courage to launch a shocking question, directly probing whether Ji-yeon was secretly dating Ki-hyeon or not. Do-young walked toward the trash can, intending to throw away the can, but suddenly froze before a haunting sight. Her eyes widened in shock, her breath hitching as she recognized a familiar item lying abandoned amidst the waste. It was the luxury cookie box tied with a pink ribbon, her father's heartfelt gift now cruelly discarded. The young girl stood paralyzed, her heart shattering as she realized her family's sincerity held no value in that person's eyes. She silently bowed her head and walked away, her overwhelming disappointment making her figure appear even smaller and more alienated in the schoolyard. Do-young desperately denied reality, screaming internally that there must be a mistake because Ki-hyeon could never be that heartless. Physical education class began. The teacher asked the class to pair up for volleyball, causing Do-young to fall into a state of panic once more. And then she painfully witnessed Ki-hyeon proactively suggesting to pair with Jaeon, completely ignoring her presence right next to him. She clung to the hollow excuse that it was just an identical box bought by another student, desperately deceiving herself to soothe the wound. However, the teacher's announcement about practicing with the person sitting next to them forced her and that teenage boy into an unavoidable confrontation. The volleyball flew high, tearing through the silent atmosphere of the gym as if signaling an approaching storm. Amidst the whispers of her classmates, Do-young was forced to pick up the fallen ball in utter embarrassment and shame. She stood frozen before Ki-hyeon, the silence between them stretching out like an endless psychological torture. Finally, she softly accepted the request, but the other person's indifference made her heart shatter even further. Suddenly, Ki-hyeon swung his arm and delivered a decisive spike, the sharp sound of impact echoing throughout the room. The teenage boy moved like a brilliant ghost, completely dominating the court and ignoring the existence of the small girl. A cold reception of the ball ended the sequence, exposing an outstanding talent accompanied by a heart of ice. The ball rolled away again. Do-young hurried to pick it up while Ki-hyeon just stood watching with an arrogant expression. His eyes at that moment held not a spark of warmth, only darkness and loathing that made Do-young feel suffocated. Ki-hyeon let out a weary sigh, closing his eyes as if standing next to her was an unbearable ordeal. Ki-hyeon suddenly approached from behind, coldly criticizing that even Do-young's standing posture was having a serious problem. The teenage boy abruptly grabbed her hand, warning that she would get hurt if she received the ball the wrong way, and poignantly pointed out the bruise becoming visible. In his breath that was close enough to be suffocating, Ki-hyeon ordered her to observe his every movement carefully, making Do-young blush with a racing heart. The young girl swallowed nervously, her lips moving as she intended to speak about the secret she had been silently keeping for so long. But Ki-hyeon's expression suddenly turned unusually gloomy. He only uttered a distant confirmation upon realizing the item she mentioned. Do-young gathered all her courage to confess that she had secretly tucked that item between the strings on his pencil case, when no one was looking. A silence enveloped the gym before the teenage boy casually admitted that he had actually read the entire content of that letter. Do-young choked up and asked again to confirm whether it was true that he had understood all her hidden thoughts. Hope flared up intensely. She turned around and asked repeatedly if he had read the letter, then did he still remember her from years ago? Do-young's eyes looked longingly at her seatmate, holding her breath waiting for an affirmation that could heal all the wounds of the past. Ki-hyeon stared intensely at Do-young and coldly remarked that perhaps she didn't understand what she was talking about. Do-young saw through his indifferent face and bitterly realized the truth that Ki-hyeon had never actually read that heartfelt letter. She stood stunned, her chest tightening in a nameless pain as the flicker of hope was cruelly extinguished. Ki-hyeon showed no mercy. He bluntly issued a warning that she needed to stop all these actions immediately. He exposed the fact that he had long noticed the sneaky glances from her seat and affirmed that it made him extremely uncomfortable. The teenage boy ran his hand through his hair wearily, admitting that all this time he had just tried to pretend not to know to save her face. But from now on, he demanded that she absolutely not look at him and never speak unless it was something truly important. Do-young turned away in humiliation, silently scolding herself as a fool for repeating the mistake of the past once again. Regret surrounded her soul as she realized she had selfishly imposed her feelings on others and caused them heavy pressure. In the middle of the vast gym, the lonely back of the young girl silently endured the bitter rejection from the very person she once worshipped with all her heart. Do-young collapsed before the harsh reality, thinking that someone like her would never be able to reach Ki-hyeon in this lifetime. The atmosphere in the classroom suddenly became suffocating under the closed curtains, reflecting the dark mood of the little girl. The boys whispered about the weather, but a lingering sense of unease made them realize something wrong was happening right now. In the middle of the room, A dark cloud loomed over Do-young as she sat motionless next to Ki-hyeon, who remained as nonchalant as ever. Jae-yeon narrowed her eyes with concern, her amber eyes resting on the weary figure of her classmate drowning in despair. The friend stepped closer, frantically asking what was wrong with Do-young and if something terrible had just occurred. Do-young didn't respond, only silently hiding behind her disheveled black hair, retreating into her shell to conceal her humiliation. But then she looked up slightly with swollen eyes, stammering a denial that she was fine, even though her tears kept falling. Jae-yeon was stunned to see her friend's miserable face, exclaiming that she looked extremely bad and could not be considered okay. In an effort to comfort, the friend leaned close to her ear and asked if Do-young was feeling unwell or suffering from unspoken physical pain. Do-young told herself that perhaps using exhaustion as an excuse to escape reality right now was the best choice for her. Jae-yeon worriedly suggested Ki-hyeon take her to the infirmary, but Do-young hurriedly refused, saying she just needed to rest for a bit. Jae-yeon's gaze suddenly became sharp, as if she had seen through the awkwardness and smelled something suspicious from the seatmate. Unexpectedly, Jae-yeon pinched Ki-hyeon's arm hard, making him startle and forcing the teenage boy to snap out of his long-held cold indifference. The friend bluntly scolded Ki-hyeon for being too heartless when seeing his seatmate sick without a bit of worry, leaving him only able to bewilderedly explain. Jae-yeon huffed and turned away, leaving a heavy silence hanging over Do-young and Ki-hyeon in the middle of the class. When the teenage boy asked, Jae-yeon coldly replied that she would go to the infirmary to get a hot pack and medicine for her classmate. But Ki-hyeon suddenly grabbed her shoulder, demanding Jae-yeon just stay put so he could personally handle everything. A moment later, Ki-hyeon returned with 2 hot packs in hand, leaving Do-young stunned by this unexpected action. Before Jae-yeon's questioning, he casually said one was for her, revealing a special concern that made Do-young's heart surge once again. Jae-yeon let out a surprised cry, questioning Ki-hyeon's sudden act of care. The teenage boy sternly reminded Jae-yeon that she had also looked tired this morning and told her to take care of herself instead of worrying about others. Jae-yeon confusedly nodded her thanks, while Do-young kept her head down in silence to hide the intense inner turmoil. Clutching the bright red hot pack, the small girl heard Jae-yeon's gentle voice asking if the pain had subsided a bit. Do-young could only softly confirm as she heard her friend ask her to relay a thank you to Ki-hyeon for that timely gift. Jae-yeon was still uneasy. She continued to offer to escort Do-young to the infirmary or help her ask for permission to go home early if the stomach pain truly worsened. The bitter truth dawned on Do-young as she sourly admitted to herself that she had just told a blatant lie about physical pain. Her conscience bled as she realized Ki-hyeon was actually the one suffering from pain many times deeper than hers. Do-young sank deep into regret, telling herself she was cowardly for using sickness as an excuse just to make things easier in front of him. The small girl's face was sorrowful, realizing this lie was the final wall separating her from their warm world. Jae-yeon smiled affectionately, thinking that someone like Ki-hyeon truly deserved to receive love from everyone. Do-young silently bowed her head, bitterly realizing that only Jae-yeon's radiance could truly warm his frozen heart. The classroom space suddenly became suffocating under the setting sun streaming through the closed curtains. The teacher's voice rang out loudly, asking the class if they clearly understood what he had just taught in the lesson. With only a few short minutes left before school ended, the teacher quickly assigned an important mission, a large group project for next week. The class began to buzz with excitement about the modern presentation topic, the impact of social media on human life. Ki-hyeon propped his chin up with indifference, his mind seemingly drifting to some far-off place instead of caring about grouping. But fate played a trick once more as the teacher demanded the 4 people sitting near each other would become a project team. Amidst the chaos of arrangement, a mysterious question arose about the prolonged absence of a male student named Kwon Tae-oh. Jae-yeon softly asked Ki-hyeon if they intended to keep waiting for the 4th member's appearance, as it seemed he would never show up. Do-young hesitantly suggested the group should still accept the absent member if he happened to show up halfway. Suddenly, a strange thought flashed through the small girl's head, making her face momentarily show signs of anxious worry. At that moment, the teacher's angry shout rang out, scolding student Kwon Tae-oh for the sin of skipping class once again. The classroom door suddenly burst open, the appearance of an uninvited guest making the entire room go silent in shock. It was the rebel Kwon. He casually looked around the class and then asked where his seat was located. Tae proactively walked toward Ji-yeon, flashing a suggestive smile and asking if he was the one who would sit next to her. Do-young trembled from extreme tension while Ki-hyeon irritably muttered something in total disgust. The young girl was aghast, wondering if there was a secret connection from the past between the radiant Ki-hyeon and that reckless boy. The atmosphere suddenly became strangely suffocating, signaling a turbulent past among the three people standing before her. Ji-yeon calmly spoke up to break the silence, nonchalantly announcing that all four of them would work on the group project together starting tomorrow. Ji-yeon smiled and suggested Do-young keep her schedule after school free so the group could discuss the upcoming presentation together. Right then, Tae smirked provocatively and asked the group at which location they should gather for convenience tomorrow. Ki-hyeon suddenly interrupted with a cold tone, directly asking Ji-yeon if the group could go to her house to work. The teenage boy's face suddenly became dark and sharp, radiating an invisible pressure that made the classroom atmosphere freeze. Breaking the tension, Ji-yeon hurriedly mentioned a cafe near school where she and Ki-hyeon often visited to study. Do-young stood silently beside them, her heart beginning to race at the reality that from tomorrow on, she would have to face him directly in this project. She thought being in the same group was an opportunity to get closer, but the harsh truth was that Ki-hyeon only saw her as a stranger he didn't know at all. The young girl hung her head in insecurity, silently wondering how she would overcome the suffocation of standing before the person who had once humiliated her. Ki-hyeon still maintained a ruthlessly cold exterior, his proud profile seemingly having completely erased her existence. Do-young hurriedly turned away to avoid his gaze, her mind replaying his cold threat that she was absolutely not allowed to look at him ever again. Do-young was stunned to feel a sudden change in the atmosphere, secretly wondering what was happening right behind her. Tae leaned forward, whispering into Ji-yeon's ear with a mocking, suggestive laugh as if asserting some secret. Ji-yeon went silent, her face showing a hint of confusion at the unexpected approach of her groupmate. Witnessing that offensive scene, Ki-hyeon gritted his teeth, his jaw tightening due to the silent rage rising within him. Do-young swallowed nervously in confusion, feeling suffocated as she realized she was caught in a vortex of pressure. A surge of bitterness made her sourly tell herself that she had just burst into a place where she never belonged. Ki-hyeon's gaze became colder and darker than ever, the teenage boy completely enveloped in a terrifying hatred. Do-young suddenly started in horror, her breath stopping when she unexpectedly faced that murderous look from the person sitting next to her. She hurriedly blurted out an apology in extreme panic, trying to shrink back to escape the suffocating pressure of the teenage boy. Ki-hyeon let out a cold confirmation, his proud profile seemingly wanting to end all connection right here. Ki-hyeon's eyes suddenly became dark. He secretly harbored a cruel intention toward all those who were bothering his life. With a terrifyingly cold expression, he affirmed that he only wanted to erase all their traces to find absolute peace. The school bell rang out like a liberation, dyeing the entire school in the brilliant sunset of the late afternoon. Ji-yeon stretched wearily, breathing a sigh of relief because finally a long day full of troubles and pressure had ended. Hearing his friend complain about the mountain of homework, Ki-hyeon slightly curled his lips and invited her to eat shaved ice to dispel all worries. A bowl of bingsu piled high with sweet fruit jam appeared, making Ji-yeon unable to hide her excitement at her friend's sudden care. The girl closed her eyes in delight, not sparing words to praise this as the best shaved ice shop she had ever tried. Ki-hyeon sat opposite, folding his arms and quietly observing his friend's every small expression with a deep, suggestive gaze. He suddenly spoke up, directly questioning Ji-yeon about the content of the secret conversation that rebel Kwon Tae had with her earlier. Ji-yeon casually recounted that Tae wanted to withdraw from the group project, making Ki-hyeon secretly satisfied because things would flow more smoothly without that obstacle. Ki-hyeon frowned thoughtfully, asserting that they could not exclude Do-young because she was also an official member of the group. Ji-yeon casually enjoyed a spoonful of bingsu, commenting that if only the two of them worked together, progress would surely be much faster and easier. The atmosphere suddenly became serious when Ji-yeon directly asked if there had been any friction between him and Do-young. The friend analyzed that Ki-hyeon was not the type to hog all the work, but would usually be the first to divide tasks most fairly. Ki-hyeon silently propped up his chin, secretly admitting in his heart that he could never hide anything from Jae-yeon's sharpness. Unexpectedly, the teenage boy confessed that he liked Do-young because she seemed like a very kind person. The twist left Jae-yeon astonished. She teased that they had only just met, but Ki-hyeon already wanted to get closer because he found the other person cute. The teenage boy's eyes suddenly became deep and mournful, a long silence enveloping his gloomy face. Jae-yeon was confused by her friend's strange reaction, secretly feeling amazed because those words truly did not match his usual personality. Sitting quietly in the cafe, the friend suddenly remembered the past and realized the last time Ki-hyeon showed such clear hatred was during those haunting middle school years. Jae-yeon slightly curled her lips, mentioning their archenemy Kwon Tae-oh, a troublemaker who made the relationship between them extremely tense. She suddenly shifted the focus to Do-young, confessing that despite the short time knowing her, being around this girl made her long to live sincerely. Emotions became complicated as she looked at the bowl of shaved ice, secretly admitting she was intensely attracted to Do-young's presence. Ki-hyeon, sitting right opposite, immediately reproached her for worrying about others, but Jae-yeon only calmly affirmed that it was her truest feeling right now. The teenage boy sank into silence, his face reflecting a sorrowful look as if struggling with selfish thoughts growing in his heart. A cold glare erupted as Ki-hyeon affirmed that that man truly made him feel uncomfortable and he wanted to get rid of him immediately. Right after that, he and Jae-yeon walked together on the sun-drenched path, creating a scene of bond that would make anyone looking on feel jealous. Standing from afar, Do-young froze, witnessing that intimacy, her chest tightening as she realized she would always be an outsider in their lives. Ki-hyeon suddenly stopped in suspicion, slightly turning his head back as if he had just detected a gaze secretly following him. His eyes became cold and sharp, exposing a terrifying aura ready to crush all hope for a reconciliation in the past. Do-young was silent in thought, secretly wondering if Ki-hyeon had truly developed feelings for that radiant friend since he only started to recover his spirit after meeting Jae-yeon. The dark past rushed back, depicting an image of a completely collapsed Ki-hyeon, where his soul was only shattered, colorless fragments. And, ironically, the only person who reached out to help him pick up those ruins to stand up after the fall turned out to be Jae-yeon. Witnessing that truth, Do-young could only bow her head in bitterness and promised herself she should be happy for him instead of letting pain gnaw at her. But the flame of jealousy still flickered, making her realize she could never accept being forever on the sidelines of happiness. Cruel time passed by. The middle school appeared like a new stage where complex relationships began to turn according to fate. Amidst the bustling hallway, Do-young suddenly felt her chest tighten when Ki-hyeon's tall figure unexpectedly appeared right next to her. The teenage boy slightly curled his lips, coldly commenting on the ironic coincidence that they were both assigned to the same class this year. A cold glare erupted through the deep eyes. Ki-hyeon coldly affirmed that that person was making him feel extremely uncomfortable. The teenage boy decisively turned away and walked off, ruthlessly extinguishing every fragile hope and leaving Do-young to sink deep into a shock that was suffocating. Ki-hyeon somberly realized that no matter where he was, scrutinizing eyes always followed him without leaving. That girl's gaze was fixed on him suggestively, not at all like the admiration of strangers. He inherently hated that feeling of being besieged. For his whole life, he had to live like a puppet under the surveillance of public opinion. However, it was exactly that child's eyes years ago that truly made him lose his mind, a persistent disturbance creeping into his very soul. Ki-hyeon casually uttered the name Chae Do-young, the cold sound ringing out as if to tear through the silence of the classroom. The young girl sitting next to him tremblingly raised her hand to confirm, her breath rapid under the invisible pressure from her seatmate. Do-young was stunned, wondering why he could mention the name that she had buried so deeply. The teenage boy propped up his chin in thought, slightly commenting that the name Chae Do-young sounded truly familiar to him. Do-young froze, cold sweat running down as she realized the ghost of the terrible past was beginning to manifest clearly. Ki-hyeon suddenly curled his lips into a sinister smile, secretly asking if she was the annoying child who had once haunted his life. In Ki-hyeon's mind, The image of the naive little girl from years ago introducing herself as Chae Do-young suddenly flashed back, and he thought to himself that even though it was fleeting, he had deeply engraved that name in his heart. How could he forget? Because that day was the worst day of his life, a terrifying memory that could never be erased. It was that haunting gaze and the name Chae Do-young of the girl standing right in front of him now, acting like a curse, ruthlessly digging up the entire filthy past he had tried so hard to bury. Hatred surged in Ki-hyeon's sharp, cold eyes, turning his handsome face terrifyingly dark. And then, from his lips escaped a vicious whisper, saying that her very existence made him sick to his stomach. Leaving behind the deadly atmosphere, the next day, the schoolyard was still vibrant with pink hues as if nothing had happened. That was also the day the group agreed to meet for their project, and Do-young couldn't hide the anxiety and fear on her face. A suffocating atmosphere enveloped them both as Do-young trudged behind Ki-hyeon, not daring to face the desk mate who had just exposed her past. Right then, the remaining two members of the group, Ji-yeon and the rebel Tae-oh, also walked in, breaking the tense atmosphere. However, Ki-hyeon's gaze, sharp as a knife, immediately shot toward Tae-oh, filled with murderous intent. The aggressive guy from earlier immediately flinched, breaking out in a cold sweat under the invisible pressure from Ki-hyeon. Completely overwhelmed, Tae-oh irritably brushed it off, yelling to just let it be, because he was going to get scolded anyway. The four of them stood in the middle of the empty classroom, a project group with complicated relationships. Could they overcome this assignment together? Finally, the whole group gathered at a coffee shop to start their first meeting. Ji-yeon, with her leadership qualities, quickly suggested dividing the topic into pros and cons, then volunteered to do the presentation. Ki-hyeon also immediately assigned tasks, saying he would make the slides and Ji-yeon would find data, then turned to ask the group if anyone knew how to use PowerPoint. All eyes silently turned to Do-young and Tae-oh, the two members considered the most unstable and unreliable in the group. Even Ki-hyeon, who had just asked the question, could only mumble awkwardly in the face of this dilemma. Ji-yeon, the only one to break the silence, turned and asked Do-young in a friendly manner which part she wanted to do. Do-young startled, stammering to answer while her eyes unconsciously darted toward Ki-hyeon, who still maintained an ice-cold attitude. Regaining her composure, she offered to take on the research part, making the excuse that she didn't have a computer at home so it would be hard to make the PowerPoint, and Ji-yeon happily agreed right away. Ki-hyeon, who had been silently typing the whole time, finally spoke up with a terse, indifferent whatever. Then his gaze shifted to Tae-oh, who was yawning widely in boredom, and thought to himself that this was someone he trusted even less than Do-young. A meaningful smile appeared on Ki-hyeon's lips, and he decided to assign Tae-oh the task of assisting Do-young with the research, considering the delegation complete. Immediately, Tae-oh stood up abruptly and announced his departure, ignoring Ji-yeon's panicked shouts that they hadn't even started working yet. The reckless guy turned back and snapped, saying that since everyone had given him the research part, he could just go home and do it, couldn't he? Ji-yeon angrily fired back, but Ki-hyeon coldly intervened, telling her not to waste her energy on that guy. But right after that, he turned to Ji-yeon, casually asking if she wanted to go home too since the tasks were assigned, leaving her so stunned that she cried out in shock. Ji-yeon immediately objected, hugging Do-young tightly and emphasizing that they all came here for group work, while Ki-hyeon merely stated casually that he was just asking. Then she turned to Do-young seeking agreement, earnestly asking if she would stay with them. Put in a dilemma, Do-young's face turned pale from extreme tension. Ultimately, under pressure from both, she could only give a tiny, hesitant nod of agreement. Seeing that, Ji-yeon cheered happily, a complete contrast to Ki-hyeon, who was still coldly focused on his laptop. Resting his chin on his hand to observe, Ki-hyeon silently judged that Ji-yeon really had no tact at all. He also realized something. It seemed his best friend genuinely liked Do-young a lot. According to Ki-hyeon, there was something pure and naive about Do-young that others lacked, and that was exactly what attracted Ji-yeon. However, Ki-hyeon narrowed his eyes mockingly, secretly sneering that this pure look actually just made Do-young appear totally clueless and empty-headed. A wave of worry suddenly arose. He feared that if this continued, Jae-yeon would drag Do-young everywhere, and things would get messed up again. Jae-yeon accidentally brought up the past when she asked Ki-hyeon if he had looked at the gift Do-young gave him. Contrary to his cold demeanor earlier, Ki-hyeon smiled and said he had eaten it all, and it was very delicious, making Jae-yeon couldn't help but feel jealous. But when Jae-yeon mentioned the presence of an accompanying letter, Do-young's face instantly changed color for fear that her hidden feelings would be exposed. Jae-yeon curiously pressed to know what was inside the letter and wanted him to share the secret, while Ki-hyeon only responded with a highly suspicious look. Do-young started to panic, trying to find an explanation, but Jae-yeon's close approach made her completely lose her bearings and fall into a dead end. Unable to bear the overwhelming psychological pressure, she suddenly burst into sobbing tears, making Jae-yeon panic, not understanding what she had done wrong. Amidst her choked sobs, Do-young begged her friend not to ask any more about that letter because it was truly too embarrassing for her. Witnessing this tearful drama, Ki-hyeon could only sigh wearily and let out a tired exclamation. His eyes became sharp and cold, containing a harsh judgment reserved for the girl across from him. He inwardly mocked that she was grown up and no longer an elementary school kid, yet she could still cry so pitifully over something so trivial. Ki-hyeon suddenly grabbed Do-young's arm, coldly telling her she should go outside for some fresh air, leaving Jae-yeon staring after them in bewilderment. Then, he casually turned to tell Jae-yeon that he was going to order more cake, leaving Do-young frozen from the pressure-filled touch. Jae-yeon smiled comfortingly, saying that sweets would help Do-young's mood improve, but the poor girl could only stammer a response in utter panic. The sunset dyed a corner of the street red, as if signaling a stormy conversation and truths about to be exposed. Standing quietly in a deserted corner, Ki-hyeon and Do-young faced each other, a thick atmosphere of tension enveloping them both. Ki-hyeon ran a hand through his hair looking exhausted, silently blaming himself for being too incompetent at hiding his true feelings and fearing that Jae-yeon had realized something. His eyes became deep and calculating. He told himself that now was absolutely not the right time to push her further away. Suddenly lowering his voice to apologize, Ki-hyeon brought up the fact that he had had to live under public scrutiny since he was a child. He bitterly recounted that among the gifts he once received, someone had heartlessly hidden a hidden camera, forcing him to always live in extreme vigilance toward everything around him. Because he had A-list actors for parents, Ki-hyeon had to grow up with the ghost of crazy stalkers, and that was the exact reason he never dared to accept any gift from strangers. Do-young shockingly realized the obvious truth that, from Ki-hyeon's perspective, the act of a stranger like her suddenly showing up and giving a gift was indeed extremely suspicious. Ki-hyeon suddenly stepped closer and directly asked if she had known him since they were both kids. That sentence made Do-young freeze as she realized that he, too, had never forgotten her haunting presence in the past. Ki-hyeon continued to confess that at his most sensitive time, the appearance of a stranger like her had genuinely made him feel terrified. Overwhelming guilt made Do-young blush deeply with shame. She was stunned and blamed herself for her abruptness back then. Unable to hold back anymore, she bowed her head in apology and expressed ultimate remorse for not caring about his feelings at that time. She tearfully explained that she was originally just a loyal fan since childhood, which was why she knew all the information about him. But since Ki-hyeon had absolutely no idea who she was, it was completely understandable that she would be misunderstood as a scary creep. Ki-hyeon flashed a meaningful smile and secretly mocked Do-young's lack of tact, even as she tried her best to deny that she was a stalker pervert. Do-young gathered her final bit of courage, softly confessing that she really liked him, and that was all the truth she wanted to say. Ki-hyeon repeated that confession with a highly skeptical look, directly forcing Do-young to face the fact that she had just said she liked him right to his face. She froze, her mind going completely blank upon realizing she had just slipped and blurted out her most hidden secret at an unexpected moment. Do-young's face turned as red as if it were about to explode. The shame and humiliation enveloped her whole body, leaving her nowhere to hide. In a state of extreme panic, she frantically waved her hands in denial and assured him he didn't need to feel pressured, silently cursing herself for this reluctant confession. Ki-hyeon suddenly stepped in close, asserting that he always knew he received a lot of admiration and directly asking if she was well aware of that too. With his inherent arrogance and confidence, He stared piercingly at her and said that only a blind person wouldn't notice his irresistible charm. The distance between the two of them was now suffocatingly close. Ki-hyeon slightly tilted his head and asked Do-young if she agreed with that thought. Taking advantage of the little girl's peak fluster, he proposed she fulfill a request for him, leaving Do-young to helplessly stammer a question back. Mesmerized by the deep gaze of her secret crush, Do-young silently promised herself that if it was a request from him, she was willing to do anything. Ki-hyeon ordered Do-young to stay away from Jaeon, while revealing a shocking secret that he had secretly been in love with his best friend for the past 5 years. He coldly demanded Do-young not to question why, because deep down he always craved to be the only one standing next to John. Meanwhile, Do-young painfully admitted that she also couldn't stand seeing anyone approach Ki-hyeon besides herself. On the other side, Jaeon flashed a radiant smile and thought to herself that it was Ki-hyeon who made her want to live more true to her heart. But Ki-hyeon was drowning in a mess, feeling himself being pulled toward an incredibly complex and unpredictable emotion. He admitted he was slowly losing his cool because this was the first time hearing Jaeon speak such suggestive confessions. Back to reality, Do-young could only stammer apologies in front of the aggressive look of the male idol standing right before her. Ki-hyeon smirked and asked back what she was apologizing for, while his gaze relentlessly pressured the poor girl. Do-young haltingly brought up that she had accidentally made a promise to Jaeon, causing Ki-hyeon to instantly change his expression and interrogate her about what kind of promise it was. He was stunned hearing Do-young talk about Jaeon's plan for the 4-person group to hang out together, a scenario completely opposite to his possessive desires. Ki-hyeon was so shocked he broke into a cold sweat hearing Do-young repeat Jaeon's words about the 3 of them hanging out. Unable to hide his agitation, he pressed to ask if Jaeon really said that right after he left. Ki-hyeon held his face in sheer helplessness, silently regretting his wrong move in directly asking Do-young to stay away from Jaeon without anticipating their bond. He backed the little girl into a corner, snapping at her to ask if fulfilling his request was that difficult even though she had just said she liked him earlier. Do-young looked agonizingly straight into Ki-hyeon's eyes and blurted out that she knew full well how huge his unrequited love for Jaeon was. She empathetically said she understood the feeling of wanting to be with the one you love, leaving Ki-hyeon stunned to hear that phrase coming from her mouth. Do-young bitterly admitted it was a romantic way of looking at it, but to her, Jaeon was the very first true friend she had ever had in her life. Under the glowing sunset sky, she affirmed that this was a huge opportunity for her to change, and she absolutely had no intention of coming between the two of them. Do-young's eyes brimmed with sincerity as she expressed that her biggest dream in life was simply to see him happy. Ki-hyeon sank into silence at the apology and the promise to fix everything that upset him, leaving a contemplative pause between 2 heavily scarred souls. In Ki-hyeon's mind, the image of the naive little girl from years ago introducing herself as Chae Do-young suddenly flashed back, and he thought to himself that even though it was fleeting, he had deeply engraved that name in his heart. How could he forget? Because that day was the worst day of his life, a terrifying memory that could never be erased. It was that haunting gaze and the name Chae Do-young of the girl standing right in front of him now, acting like a curse, ruthlessly digging up the entire filthy past he had tried so hard to bury. Hatred surged in Ki-hyeon's sharp, cold eyes, turning his handsome face terrifyingly dark. And then, from his lips escaped a vicious whisper, saying that her very existence made him sick to his stomach. Leaving behind the deadly atmosphere, the next day, the schoolyard was still vibrant with pink hues as if nothing had happened. That was also the day the group agreed to meet for their project, and Do-young couldn't hide the anxiety and fear on her face. A suffocating atmosphere enveloped them both as Do-young trudged behind Ki-hyeon, not daring to face the desk mate who had just exposed her past. Right then, the remaining 2 members of the group, Jaeon and the rebel Teo, also walked in, breaking the tense atmosphere. However, Ki-hyeon's gaze, sharp as a knife, immediately shot toward Teo, filled with murderous intent. The aggressive guy from earlier immediately flinched, breaking out in a cold sweat under the invisible pressure from Ki-hyeon. Completely overwhelmed, Teo irritably brushed it off, yelling to just let it be, because he was going to get scolded anyway. The 4 of them stood in the middle of the empty classroom, a project group with complicated relationships, Could they overcome this assignment together? Finally, the whole group gathered at a coffee shop to start their first meeting. Ji-yeon, with her leadership qualities, quickly suggested dividing the topic into pros and cons, then volunteered to do the presentation. Ki-hyeon also immediately assigned tasks, saying he would make the slides and Ji-yeon would find data, then turn to ask the group if anyone knew how to use PowerPoint. All eyes silently turned to Do-young and Tae-oh, the two members considered the most unstable and unreliable in the group. Even Ki-hyeon, who had just asked the question, could only mumble awkwardly in the face of this dilemma. Ji-yeon, the only one to break the silence, turned and asked Do-young in a friendly manner which part she wanted to do. Do-young startled, stammering to answer while her eyes unconsciously darted toward Ki-hyeon, who still maintained an ice-cold attitude. Regaining her composure, she offered to take on the research part, making the excuse that she didn't have a computer at home so it would be hard to make the PowerPoint, and Ji-yeon happily agreed right away. Ki-hyeon, who had been silently typing the whole time, finally spoke up with a terse, indifferent whatever. Then his gaze shifted to Tae-oh, who was yawning widely in boredom, and thought to himself that this was someone he trusted even less than Do-young. A meaningful smile appeared on Ki-hyeon's lips, and he decided to assign Tae-oh the task of assisting Do-young with the research, considering the delegation complete. Immediately, Tae-oh stood up abruptly and announced his departure, ignoring Ji-yeon's panic shouts that they hadn't even started working yet. The reckless guy turned back and snapped, saying that since everyone had given him the research part, he could just go home and do it, couldn't he? Ji-yeon angrily fired back, but Ki-hyeon coldly intervened, telling her not to waste her energy on that guy. But right after that, he turned to Ji-yeon, casually asking if she wanted to go home too since the tasks were assigned, leaving her so stunned that she cried out in shock. Ji-yeon immediately objected, hugging Do-young tightly and emphasizing that they all came here for group work, while Ki-hyeon merely stated casually that he was just asking. Then she turned to Do-young seeking agreement, earnestly asking if she would stay with them. Put in a dilemma, Do-young's face turned pale from extreme tension. Ultimately, under pressure from both, she could only give a tiny, hesitant nod of agreement. Seeing that, Ji-yeon cheered happily, a complete contrast to Ki-hyeon, who was still coldly focused on his laptop. Resting his chin on his hand to observe, Ki-hyeon silently judged that Ji-yeon really had no tact at all. He also realized something. It seemed his best friend genuinely liked Do-young a lot. According to Ki-hyeon, there was something pure and naive about Do-young that others lacked, and that was exactly what attracted Ji-yeon. However, Ki-hyeon narrowed his eyes mockingly, secretly sneering that this pure look actually just made Do-young appear totally clueless and empty-headed. A wave of worry suddenly arose. He feared that if this continued, Ji-yeon would drag Do-young everywhere and things would get messed up again. Ji-yeon accidentally brought up the past when she asked Ki-hyeon if he had looked at the gift Do-young gave him. Contrary to his cold demeanor earlier, Ki-hyeon smiled and said he had eaten it all and it was very delicious, making Ji-yeon couldn't help but feel jealous. But when Ji-yeon mentioned the presence of an accompanying letter, Do-young's face instantly changed color for fear that her hidden feelings would be exposed. Ji-yeon curiously pressed to know what was inside the letter and wanted him to share the secret, while Ki-hyeon only responded with a highly suspicious look. Do-young started to panic, trying to find an explanation, but Ji-yeon's close approach made her completely lose her bearings and fall into a dead end. Unable to bear the overwhelming psychological pressure, she suddenly burst into sobbing tears, making Ji-yeon panic, not understanding what she had done wrong. Amidst her choked sobs, Do-young begged her friend not to ask any more about that letter because it was truly too embarrassing for her. Witnessing this tearful drama, Ki-hyeon could only sigh wearily and let out a tired exclamation. His eyes became sharp and cold, containing a harsh judgment reserved for the girl across from him. He inwardly mocked that she was grown up and no longer an elementary school kid, yet she could still cry so pitifully over something so trivial. Ki-hyeon suddenly grabbed Do-young's arm, coldly telling her she should go outside for some fresh air, leaving Ji-yeon staring after them in bewilderment. Then, he casually turned to tell Ji-yeon that he was going to order more cake, leaving Do-young frozen from the pressure-filled touch. Ji-yeon smiled comfortingly, saying that sweets would help Do-young's mood improve, but the poor girl could only stammer a response in utter panic. The sunset dyed a corner of the street red, as if signaling a stormy conversation and truths about to be exposed. Standing quietly in a deserted corner, Ki-hyeon and Do-young faced each other, a thick atmosphere of tension enveloping them both. Ki-hyeon ran a hand through his hair looking exhausted, silently blaming himself for being too incompetent at hiding his true feelings and fearing that Jaeon had realized something. His eyes became deep and calculating. He told himself that now was absolutely not the right time to push her further away. Suddenly lowering his voice to apologize, Ki-hyeon brought up the fact that he had had to live under public scrutiny since he was a child. He bitterly recounted that among the gifts he once received, someone had heartlessly hidden a hidden camera, forcing him to always live in extreme vigilance toward everything around him. Because he had A-list actors for parents, Ki-hyeon had to grow up with the ghost of crazy stalkers, and that was the exact reason he never dared to accept any gift from strangers. Do-young shockingly realized the obvious truth that, from Ki-hyeon's perspective, the act of a stranger like her suddenly showing up and giving a gift was indeed extremely suspicious. Ki-hyeon suddenly stepped closer and directly asked if she had known him since they were both kids. That sentence made Do-young freeze as she realized that he, too, had never forgotten her haunting presence in the past. Ki-hyeon continued to confess that at his most sensitive time, the appearance of a stranger like her had genuinely made him feel terrified. Overwhelming guilt made Do-young blush deeply with shame. She was stunned and blamed herself for her abruptness back then. Unable to hold back anymore, she bowed her head in apology and expressed ultimate remorse for not caring about his feelings at that time. She tearfully explained that she was originally just a loyal fan since childhood, which was why she knew all the information about him. But since Ki-hyeon had absolutely no idea who she was, it was completely understandable that she would be misunderstood as a scary creep. Ki-hyeon flashed a meaningful smile and secretly mocked Do-young's lack of tact, even as she tried her best to deny that she was a stalker pervert. Do-young gathered her final bit of courage, softly confessing that she really liked him, and that was all the truth she wanted to say. Ki-hyeon repeated that confession with a highly skeptical look, directly forcing Do-young to face the fact that she had just said she liked him right to his face. She froze, her mind going completely blank upon realizing she had just slipped and blurted out her most hidden secret at an unexpected moment. Do-young's face turned as red as if it were about to explode. The shame and humiliation enveloped her whole body, leaving her nowhere to hide. In a state of extreme panic, she frantically waved her hands in denial and assured him he didn't need to feel pressured, silently cursing herself for this reluctant confession. Ki-hyeon suddenly stepped in close, asserting that he always knew he received a lot of admiration and directly asking if she was well aware of that too. With his inherent arrogance and confidence, he stared piercingly at her and said that only a blind person wouldn't notice his irresistible charm. The distance between the two of them was now suffocatingly close. Ki-hyeon slightly tilted his head and asked Do-young if she agreed with that thought. Taking advantage of the little girl's peak fluster, he proposed she fulfill a request for him, leaving Do-young to helplessly stammer a question back. Mesmerized by the deep gaze of her secret crush, Do-young silently promised herself that if it was a request from him, she was willing to do anything. Ki-hyeon ordered Do-young to stay away from Jaeon, while revealing a shocking secret that he had secretly been in love with his best friend for the past 5 years. He coldly demanded Do-young not to question why, because deep down he always craved to be the only one standing next to John. Meanwhile, Do-young painfully admitted that she also couldn't stand seeing anyone approach Ki-hyeon besides herself. On the other side, Jaeon flashed a radiant smile and thought to herself that it was Ki-hyeon who made her want to live more true to her heart. But Ki-hyeon was drowning in a mess, feeling himself being pulled toward an incredibly complex and unpredictable emotion. He admitted he was slowly losing his cool because this was the first time hearing Jaeon speak such suggestive confessions. Back to reality, Do-young could only stammer apologies in front of the aggressive look of the male idol standing right before her. Ki-hyeon smirked and asked back what she was apologizing for, while his gaze relentlessly pressured the poor girl. Do-young haltingly brought up that she had accidentally made a promise to Ji-yeon, causing Ki-hyeon to instantly change his expression and interrogate her about what kind of promise it was. He was stunned hearing Do-young talk about Ji-yeon's plan for the four-person group to hang out together, a scenario completely opposite to his possessive desires. Ki-hyeon was so shocked he broke into a cold sweat hearing Do-young repeat Ji-yeon's words about the three of them hanging out. Unable to hide his agitation, he pressed to ask if Ji-yeon really said that right after he left. Ki-hyeon held his face in sheer helplessness, silently regretting his wrong move in directly asking Do-young to stay away from Ji-yeon without anticipating their bond. He backed the little girl into a corner, snapping at her to ask if fulfilling his request was that difficult even though she had just said she liked him earlier. Do-young looked agonizingly straight into Ki-hyeon's eyes and blurted out that she knew full well how huge his unrequited love for Ji-yeon was. In the cafe, Ki-hyeon looked at his work on his laptop, silently judging that the presentation slides looked quite good already. He turned and informed Do-young and Ji-yeon that this was the material submitted by the reckless Kwon-tae-oh, causing Ji-yeon to ask in shock if it was really him. Ji-yeon smiled with satisfaction, holding up her phone to show that while it wasn't much and the data wasn't perfect, at least Tae-oh had actually done his part. Contrary to his friend's cheerfulness, Ki-hyeon only watched silently with a suspicious gaze, an indescribable doubt rising in his heart. Night fell, returning silence to the empty streets. Ji-yeon walked slowly and alone on her way home, her mind still lingering on the stressful group meeting. Suddenly, a figure appeared out of nowhere and blocked her path, making her stop in surprise, confused about what was happening. Her face showed a hint of confusion when she realized who was standing in front of her. It was Kwon-tae-oh, the arrogant guy who spoke up to ask what a girl was doing out here at this hour. He approached, reaching out toward the wary Ji-yeon, continuing to tease that this place happened to be a deserted spot as well. Ji-yeon took a step back, clutching her backpack straps with a guarded look, questioning why he was here and how he knew where she lived. Tae-oh seemed a bit flustered by the girl's assertiveness, only able to stammer a meaningless "ah." He scratched his cheek, trying to act casual as he explained that he just happened to find out. But Ji-yeon didn't believe those words at all. She growled, demanding he explain clearly how he had actually found it. Tae-oh quickly waved his hands, telling her not to misunderstand. He had just accidentally seen her in front of the cram school. Ji-yeon's eyes suddenly flashed with fear. She remembered that Seo Ki-hyeon was with her at that time, which was why she felt awkward. A terrifying thought suddenly occurred to her. Had he been following her since then without her knowing? Seeing her silence, Tae-oh scratched his head and complained that she was making him feel uncomfortable. Then he suddenly threw out a shocking question, casually asking if she didn't have feelings for him too, leaving Ji-yeon completely stunned and not understanding what he was talking about. Tae-oh loudly accused her of using the group project as an excuse to message him privately and for answering all of his messages. He continued to claim that it seemed Seo Ki-hyeon didn't know anything about this, and if she really didn't like it, she would have told him. Ji-yeon froze, realizing she was in serious trouble because Kwon-tae-oh had completely misunderstood. Looking back, Ji-yeon realized her glimmer of hope for Kwon-tae-oh began when she saw him actually send the material for the group project. However, at the same time, he constantly tried to steer the conversation toward personal topics, even sending a picture of a cat and teasing that it looked exactly like her. The annoyance grew daily as he messaged to ask if she was going to skip class, then lingered on her personal stories to ask private questions. Ji-yeon had tried to brush it off by saying she was going to sleep, thinking everything would be fine as long as she set clear boundaries, but she didn't expect it to lead to last night's confrontation. The next morning, a new day began, clearing away the suffocating atmosphere of the previous night. Ji-yeon happily greeted Ki-hyeon when she saw her best friend, and he smiled back, asking if she had arrived. The two walked side by side, creating a very beautiful scene under the morning sun. They walked through the school gate together, attracting the admiring gazes of other students. Ki-hyeon kept a gentle smile while chatting with her, seemingly wanting to dispel the worries in his best friend's heart. However, the smile on Ki-hyeon's lips suddenly vanished, his eyes becoming chillingly sharp as he abruptly asked, signaling that something bad was about to happen. Ki-hyeon suddenly asked if something had happened, leaving Ji-yeon confused about what her friend was implying. He pointed out that she looked a bit tired, but Jaeon immediately forced a smile, quickly denying it and asking why he thought so. With sweat beading on her forehead, her smile clearly couldn't hide the embarrassment and anxiety following the encounter last night. Jaeon quickly made the excuse that she had just stayed up a bit late studying last night, trying to act cheerful to dispel Ki-hyeon's suspicion. She even teased that she didn't expect Seo Ki-hyeon to be so observant, a clear effort to redirect the conversation. However, the unease remained as she quickly took out her phone to check her reflection, wondering if her skin looked that bad today. Ki-hyeon just remained silent, his gaze becoming deep and unpredictable in the face of his best friend's avoidance. That tense atmosphere seemed to linger as they entered the classroom. From her seat, Do-young noticed something very strange, as Ki-hyeon put his face down on the desk looking exhausted, while Jaeon sat above him unusually somber. The girl quietly observed, a big question mark rising in her mind about the abnormality between the two close friends. Looking at the silent figure of her seatmate, Do-young silently guessed whether Ki-hyeon was upset about something today. The girl's mind was a mess, unable to stop worrying about the gloomy atmosphere covering the whole class. She was certain that the reason for Ki-hyeon's slump since this morning definitely had to do with Jaeon. Do-young's eyes didn't leave the two, silently wondering if something had happened to Jaeon. Just then, another male student came to report that the teacher was looking for Seo Ki-hyeon, but he only gave a curt reply. The friend invited him to play soccer after lunch, but Ki-hyeon coldly refused, saying he wouldn't participate today. While the friend tried to insist because the team was short on players, Do-young suddenly realized this was her golden opportunity. Thinking and doing, she turned to Jaeon with a bright smile, calling her friend's name, making Jaeon startle and turn back. Do-young offered to go to the snack bar with Jaeon, saying she also wanted to pay her back for the coffee the other day, but Jaeon quickly waved her hand in refusal. Jaeon shyly explained that it wasn't anything big, so it was embarrassing to call it repaying a favor, but Do-young still insisted on her invitation. Do-young looked straight into her friend's eyes, sincerely expressing that she didn't need repayment and simply wanted to go to the snack bar with Jaeon. That simple confession left Jaeon completely stunned, covering her mouth in surprise at seeing another side of her shy friend for the first time. Without letting Jaeon refuse, Do-young grabbed her hand and eagerly urged her to go, and at this sudden enthusiasm, Jaeon could only confusedly agree. Jaeon stood up happily, saying she would run to the restroom for a moment first, and Do-young nodded cheerfully. However, as soon as Jaeon left, Ki-hyeon returned to the classroom with a cold, expressionless face. His eyes scanned the room, clearly searching for the figure of his best friend. Ki-hyeon approached Do-young and asked where Jaeon was, and upon hearing her explain the plan to go to the snack bar, he immediately frowned. His gaze became full of scrutiny, asking if it was just the two of them going together, leaving Do-young only able to stammer a confirmation. And then an unexpected twist occurred. Ki-hyeon suddenly declared he would go along too, leaving Do-young completely speechless. Her face turned pale with panic, hurriedly saying that she would go talk to Jaeon, secretly hoping she could save the situation. Seeing Ki-hyeon's gloomy expression, Do-young seemed to understand, softly asking if he was worried about Jaeon. She mustered all her courage, suggesting that she would go ask Jaeon what exactly had happened. However, Ki-hyeon immediately brushed it off, leaning in close with a look of contempt, growling to ask why Jaeon would confide in someone she didn't even know well and who Do-young thought she was. Despite his bitter words, Ki-hyeon secretly felt it was strange. This girl somehow knew exactly what he was facing. Under Ki-hyeon's pressure, Do-young lowered her head and stammered, making the excuse that perhaps such things would be easier to talk about with a female friend. Then, she looked up straight into his eyes, sincerely confessing that she also wanted to be able to help him too. The girl's sudden honesty seemed to touch Ki-hyeon. He turned away, dropping an "okay, just do what you want," making Do-young ask in surprise if he was serious. Ki-hyeon coldly confirmed, adding that he didn't expect much anyway before turning to walk away, leaving Do-young stunned at the unexpected permission. Just then, Jaeon poked her head through the classroom door, happily calling Do-young's name, saying "let's go." The two girls left the classroom together, starting a conversation that could change everything. At a bench on the school campus, Do-young and Jaeon sat next to each other, Do-young gently said thank you for the drink and promised she would enjoy it. Do-young hesitated for a moment and then called her friend's name, asking if something had happened today that made Ji-yeon unhappy. Ji-yeon looked at Do-young with a look of surprise, asking in shock how Do-young could realize it so quickly. Do-young lowered her head, sincerely confessing that she only noticed because she always follows Ki-hyeon's every gesture. Hearing that, Ji-yeon burst into laughter, praising Do-young for being wonderful and stating that normally only Ki-hyeon was perceptive enough to notice her mood that fast. Afterward, Do-young continued to gently comfort her, saying that if the matter was too difficult to share, Ji-yeon should just be honest with herself. She promised she was always willing to listen, and though Ji-yeon might not want to say it, she truly hoped she could help her friend. Ji-yeon looked at Do-young, the smile on her lips gradually becoming softer, then exclaimed that Do-young really likes her, doesn't she? Do-young froze for a moment at the direct question from her best friend, while the surrounding space seemed to brighten up. Ji-yeon sat there, smiling meaningfully, waiting for the answer from her little friend who was trembling with emotion beside her. Ji-yeon looked at Do-young, her eyes filled with emotion seeing this small girl worry about her so much, even if it wasn't yet to the extent of how Ki-hyeon usually cared. Do-young looked at her friend, telling herself that now she really needed a friend like Ji-yeon, someone she could talk to about everything without any pressure. No longer avoiding it, Ji-yeon began to retell the story of Kwon-tae from last night, making the atmosphere around them sink with heaviness. Do-young heard her friend's confession, her eyes widening in horror, feeling the rapid breathing of both people. Silence enveloped them for a few beats before Do-young asked in a trembling voice if it was dangerous and why Ji-yeon didn't feel afraid. Ji-yeon confessed that she was also very scared, but she believed that Kwon-tae wouldn't actually do anything to hurt her. Do-young sank into thought, her mind racing as she tried to find a way to help her friend escape that annoying man. Right now, Ji-yeon looked straight at Do-young with a serious expression, wondering if telling Ki-hyeon about these things would be the best option. Do-young froze, her eyes reflecting deep thought when faced with her best friend's suggestion. The two looked at each other in silence, while the thought of having to face Ki-hyeon began to haunt Do-young's mind. Her eyes widening in sheer amazement, Do-young stammered out words of denial, unable to believe the terrible pressure her best friend had to endure from the heroic shadow of her parents. Do-young's face turned pale, her lips parting slightly, but unable to form a complete sentence, her mind completely shattered by the tragic past hidden behind Daeon's everyday smile. In contrast to that shock, Ji-yeon squeezed her eyes shut and flashed a heartbreakingly radiant smile, casually explaining that she couldn't possibly turn a blind eye or refuse to help the weak without a valid reason. However, that smile suddenly faded, giving way to sorrowful eyes as Ji-yeon lowered her voice to confess that there was a moment she truly felt extremely disappointed by Ki-hyeon's ruthlessness. Sitting and swinging her legs on the stone bench, Ji-yeon tilted her head slightly to look at Do-young, slowly confirming what everyone had probably implicitly realized about the irreconcilable feud between Ki-hyeon and Kwon-tae. The curtain of the past was once again pulled up, revealing a cruel twist with the image of a blood-stained Ki-hyeon, his head bowed and panting heavily in a space thick with the scent of violence, completely shattering his perfect idol image. His purple eyes glared, blazing with a bloodthirsty madness as his hand tightly gripped his enemy's collar, growling to reveal a fire of hatred that had taken deep root since their middle school years. Recalling those dark days, Ji-yeon bitterly thought about her own obsessive complex, the self-hypnosis that forced her to befriend everyone because she always firmly believed it was the most righteous mission. Ji-yeon's hands clasped tightly together in tension, as she bitterly admitted that this toxic habit had turned her into someone always restlessly searching for isolated or abandoned students to bestow her attention upon. Hearing this, Do-young's heart felt like it was being squeezed, her gaze dropping with extreme skepticism as she internally tormented herself, wondering if the initial bond between her and Ki-hyeon also stemmed from such cheap pity. Ji-yeon recalled that when she first met Kwon-tae in their first year of high school, he carried an aura completely different from now. Back then, he was an extremely quiet teenager, almost never speaking a word to anyone in class. Feeling pity for her classmates' loneliness, Ji-yeon took the initiative to approach him and introduce herself first. However, Contrary to his gentle appearance, his initial attitude was quite rude and unapproachable. Despite this, Ji-yeon persisted in finding ways to connect, trying to treat Tae-oh very well so that he would open up more. After a while, her efforts were finally rewarded when Tae-oh began to reveal his true self. The naked truth left Ji-yeon horrified. It turned out he was someone who used violence as entertainment, frequently beating others and viewing it as a joke. Worse yet, he had a bizarre hobby of performing actions that were extremely insulting to others' dignity, which Ji-yeon found disgusting. Typically, he would casually pull out his phone, brazenly bragging about a sensitive photo of another girl and mocking that it looked like her. When Ji-yeon angrily yelled that he was a madman and a jerk, Tae-oh just smirked, casually asking why she was getting angry when he was complimenting her. Kwon Tae-oh looked at his phone nonchalantly, making sarcastic remarks that girls these days really don't know what limits are. He spoke disparagingly about how smoking made him look cooler, then bragged about acting like a gangster to show off to his friends. Just like that, his classmates gradually felt disgusted and miserable because of his persistent pranks. A group of friends asked each other if Kim Ji-yeon was spoiling and protecting him to an excessive degree. They didn't understand why Ji-yeon insisted on covering for someone like that, even bluntly suggesting that if he wanted to be a big shot, he should just get out of this class. Eventually, no one in class wanted to associate with Tae-oh anymore, and everyone turned their backs on him together. Witnessing that scene, Ji-yeon felt guilty seeing Tae-oh become completely isolated. She put a lot of effort into convincing her classmates to give him a chance, trying to explain away his behavior. Ji-yeon turned to Tae-oh and said that, fine, if she said so, then he would have to agree. Tae-oh pretended not to care, but as soon as she turned away and sent her thanks, he immediately hid behind the door with a sinister smirk and a mocking laugh. In the middle of the sun-drenched schoolyard, Ji-yeon gently sent a word of thanks to Ki-hyeon, while her friend calmly replied and kindly asked if her life was really going smoothly lately. However, Ji-yeon's somewhat forced attitude immediately made Ki-hyeon freeze, his eyes narrowing with suspicion and confusion at his best friend's deeply troubled expression. At that moment, Kwon Tae-oh suddenly appeared with his usual arrogant demeanor, standing with his arms crossed and looking at them both with a cold, provocative gaze. Ki-hyeon immediately glared, a murderous aura bursting forth as he glanced at the insolent guy over Ji-yeon's shoulder, silently cursing and wondering what on earth he was babbling about. Immediately, a fiery clash broke out, forcing Ji-yeon to frantically step in and intervene, while Tae-oh repeatedly mocked Ki-hyeon's physique and sneered that others followed his orders only for superficial reasons. Ignoring his opponent's fury, Tae-oh turned away with a chilling indifference, casually declaring that he didn't have time to worry about or control their actual feelings. At the same time, in a shadowed corner of the hallway, a group of boys began to whisper and gossip about how Ki-hyeon and Ji-yeon had been inseparable since elementary school, a rare and strong bond. The story went further as they suspected the two were secretly dating and chose the same school on purpose, unaware that Ki-hyeon's murderous aura was rising intensely right next to them in rage. The silent school setting was suddenly broken by a piece of sincere advice, reminding the young girl that she didn't need to sacrifice herself and put so much pressure on herself. Standing opposite Tae-oh, Ji-yeon bowed her head and bit her nails in extreme agony, confessing in a helpless voice that deep down, she simply wanted everyone to live in harmony. Ji-yeon stepped closer, worriedly holding the shoulders of her trembling friend, softly calling Tae-oh's name to reassure him. However, in response to that concern were only choked sobs. Tae-oh bowed his head and walked away, trying to hide his weakness. The sound of teeth clenching tightly echoed as Tae-oh could not suppress the rage exploding in his heart. In the blink of an eye, he suddenly landed a powerful punch that sent another male student collapsing to the classroom floor. The other student asked in panic if he had just bumped into him, but Tae-oh only glared defiantly. Without any remorse, he roared that it was damn frustrating that even hitting people couldn't satisfy him. Ji-yeon, standing nearby, had a face full of horror as she witnessed Tae-oh's increasingly worsening violent behavior. Unable to stay silent any longer, she rushed out to block him, loudly questioning why he was blatantly hitting a classmate. Ji-yeon choked back tears, begging Tae-oh to stop hurting everyone, warning him that this impulsive action would only make his situation worse. Teo stopped in surprise, his expression shifting from anger to amazement as he faced Ji-yeon's sincere reproaches. Teo smirked arrogantly, agreeing that what Ji-yeon just said was absolutely correct. He made a provocative offer, saying that if she did something for him, he would behave well exactly as she wanted. The students in the class were stunned, asking each other in shock if they had misheard. The whole class buzzed with the shocking news that Kim Ji-yeon and Kwon Teo were actually dating each other. Ki-hyeon sat there, his deep purple eyes becoming lifeless, as he stunnedly repeated the question of whether this was the truth. Instinctively, a sharp pain rose as Ki-hyeon wondered why it wasn't him, why Ji-yeon chose that guy. In a corner of the hallway, a group of girls gathered, wondering if Ji-yeon was being threatened or coerced by Teo. They thought this was completely unbelievable and totally illogical for someone like Ji-yeon. A female friend spoke up to analyze that even though Ji-yeon knew Teo's personality was nothing but trash, she still stubbornly asked everyone to hang out with him. Classmates kept doubting, silently wondering if Ji-yeon was actually dating him just because she had already fallen in love with him. His hands gripped the desk so tightly that green veins popped out. Ki-hyeon tried to suppress the boiling rage in his blood as he heard the surrounding whispers mocking Ji-yeon's terrible taste in boyfriends. Immediately, he rushed out to the empty schoolyard, heavily dropping his head on a stone bench and repeatedly calling his best friend with a bad premonition clouding his mind. His patience exhausted, Ki-hyeon furrowed his brows in frustration, grumpily questioning the other end of the line as to why she dared to ignore his consecutive calls. It turned out that at that time, Ji-yeon was being cornered in a secluded alley, facing an intense interrogation from another male student about why she accepted being involved with that trash Kwon Teo. The male student's face darkened with fury at Ji-yeon's silent endurance. He gritted his teeth and uttered a reluctant acceptance while she could only stare down at her phone screen. Not letting the matter reach a dead end, he suddenly raised the phone high in the air, loudly declaring that it was time to end all this rotten trouble once and for all. Right at the height of the tension, Ki-hyeon's purple eyes flashed with chilling murderous intent when the male student on the other end decided to yield, bluntly revealing their current location to lure him into settling it personally. Listening to the vivid account from her best friend, Do-young gulped in fear, her forehead beaded with sweat as she imagined Ki-hyeon's devastating wrath at that moment. Unable to suppress her curiosity mixed with unease, Do-young hesitated to speak, softly asking Ji-yeon what horrific event actually struck right after that fateful moment. Ji-yeon's lips trembled hauntingly. She recalled the remnants of the memory and slowly admitted that it was the first time in her life she had to witness a scene of violence far beyond any human limit. Darkness enveloped the gloomy space where Ki-hyeon slumped down, panting with his shirt stained with blood, signaling a storm of violence that had just swept through. Looking up with a blood-smeared face, his purple eyes glowed with an extreme madness, proving that the last boundary of reason had snapped and he had completely surrendered himself to the instinct of slaughter. Witnessing that horrific scene, Ji-yeon panicked and rushed forward like an arrow, frantically screaming his name in the empty alley with the faint hope of pulling him out of the abyss of rage. Tears streaming down her pale face, she screamed out, questioning why he had acted so inhumanly cruel. But the only response to that despair was a deadly silence as Ki-hyeon coldly pinned the thug Teo to the cold ground, ignoring all the reproaches from the very girl he cherished most. The flashback suddenly shifted, bringing everything into a lull. Ji-yeon silently and bitterly admitted that anyone looking at it would find her protective thoughts and actions back then truly ridiculous. However, hidden beneath that blind meddling was a tearful past as she buried her head in Ki-hyeon's chest, sobbing as she confessed the invisible pressure of being the daughter of heroes. Childhood memories rushed back with the image of a warm hand stroking her head in comfort, accompanied by the deeply ingrained teaching that one must never turn away from those struggling in trouble. It was the grand silhouette of her parents in bright orange rescue uniforms, the people who traded their lives to plant the seeds of kindness and expected her to continue that noble ideal. The radiant, innocent smile of young Ji-yeon clutching her teddy bear closed the tragic memory, leaving a profound sorrow as she choked out the revelation that those were also their final words before death. In the fiery night of her mind, She remembered the haunting stories told by her own relatives. She told herself she understood the loneliness of being abandoned better than anyone. So how could she sit still and watch Tae slide down like that? Ji-yeon desperately realized she couldn't turn a blind eye. She didn't know Tae was making the whole class so miserable. Though she didn't want to admit it, she knew she was the only one who could stop him when he had completely lost his mind. In a hidden corner of the hallway, she rushed to hug Tae, trying to use her sincerity to soothe the angry monster inside him. Ki-hyeon's eyes turned cold as he saw that scene, silently thinking that now he understood everything. He thought Do-young had no choice but to enter this complex relationship because she was the only one who could turn the tide. Ji-yeon looked straight into Ki-hyeon's eyes, wiped away her tears, and determinedly said that from this moment on she would stand up to help him. That was the moment Seo Ki-hyeon completely changed. His eyes no longer held fury, but became terrifyingly still. He no longer struggled, reflecting on his previous action of hitting Tae and then deciding to go to the teacher to confess all his sins. In Do-young's heart, a painful truth gradually formed as she realized that Ki-hyeon, the person she always worshipped, was a true hero in everyone's eyes. Cheers echoed throughout the classroom as the crowd together praised Ki-hyeon for directly punishing the thug Kwon Tae by breaking his nose. Witnessing the people around her not hesitating to praise Ki-hyeon's violent act, Do-young could only stand still, watching with extreme confusion. In contrast to his usual coldness toward the world, Ki-hyeon wore a meaningful and friendly smile when looking toward Ji-yeon. He waved for Ji-yeon to come closer, an attitude that made Do-young wonder what he was planning. Just then, a classmate approached and revealed to Ji-yeon that Ki-hyeon had personally retold the story of Kwon Tae forcing her to be his girlfriend. They even claimed Ki-hyeon said Ji-yeon only reluctantly agreed to that relationship out of compassion for their classmates. Ki-hyeon casually reassured that from now on Ji-yeon would never have to worry about Kwon Tae again, leaving those around them only able to nod in agreement. Everything around Do-young suddenly became lonely, as she bitterly realized she was no longer the one Ki-hyeon cared about like before. Watching Ki-hyeon surrounded by friends and Ji-yeon's attention, she could only question herself whether she was wrong to have revealed all the secrets. Sitting despondently on the stone bench under the tree's shade, Do-young bowed her head, blaming her past self for being too naive, bitterly realizing that what she once mistook for kindness ended up becoming a knife stabbing deep into someone else. Tension quickly enveloped Ji-yeon as she revealed a look of extreme panic and tremblingly confessed that she was terrified seeing the terrible situation from years ago repeating, fearing Ki-hyeon would once again lose his reason and turn dark. Seeing her best friend bear such a heavy psychological burden, Do-young could only force a pained smile to soothe the atmosphere, but Ji-yeon lowered her head slightly, heavily blaming herself for dragging everyone into this mess. Her black hair hung down, hiding half of her sad face. Ji-yeon sank deep into the black hole of torment, feeling bitter for a part of Ki-hyeon's past full of darkness and hurt that she never had the chance to fully understand. Witnessing her friend's back laden with heavy thoughts on the bench, a spark of suspicion suddenly flashed in Do-young's mind. She hypothesized whether Ki-hyeon really acted impulsively, or if he had anticipated every move since he first stepped into this trouble. The image of a terrifyingly silent Ki-hyeon appeared clearly in her thoughts, suggesting a deadly scenario if he had actually grasped the entire cowardly plot of the enemy. And if that were true, no one could predict what brutal tactics he would unleash in his next steps. Recalling the events, Ji-yeon's face broke into a cold sweat, her eyes showing extreme tension as she confessed that she had once been certain Ki-hyeon would fly into a rage and tear everything apart. But completely contrary to those anxious speculations, Ki-hyeon was actually casually leaning against the cold wall in the hallway with his arms crossed, eyes closed, waiting with a strangely composed demeanor. Ji-yeon sat quietly on the bench, her face heavy with regret as she admitted that her past naivety and good intentions had actually unintentionally hurt others. Her trembling eyes looked at Do-young, confessing her fear that history was repeating itself and that she herself would cause Ki-hyeon to fall into a deep, dark abyss once again, just like years ago. Forcing a bitter, strained smile, Ji-yeon scratched her head and left her sentence hanging, as if she were at a dead end trying to find a way out of her past mistakes. Witnessing her friend's pain, Do-young summoned all her courage to assert that Jae-yeon had done nothing wrong and that the past tragedies were inherently just unintended accidents. The young girl bowed her head determinedly, her eyes sincere as she reassured Jae-yeon that in reality, there were still people saved by that kindness, and they would be grateful to her for the rest of their lives. Jae-yeon listened in stunned silence as Do-young used herself as an example, describing herself as a sullen, clumsy person who always carried a gloomy aura that frightened everyone around her. But just as she confessed how grateful she was to be accepted for who she truly was by Jae-yeon, Do-young suddenly froze, panicking internally and wondering if she was saying things that were way too weird. Embarrassment washed over Do-young's pale face, and she secretly feared that Jae-yeon would start finding her annoying and eccentric after that confession. Contrary to those worries, Jae-yeon looked up with deeply moved, glistening eyes, softly admitting that those were exactly the words of comfort she had been longing to hear the most. As if infused with newfound energy, Jae-yeon suddenly sprang up from the bench and cheered in gratitude to Do-young, leaving the shy girl completely frozen by her friend's sudden change in demeanor. Jae-yeon flashed a radiant smile with sparkling eyes, cheerfully declaring that the two of them could be friends for a long time, or even best friends for life. That sincerity left Do-young stunned for a moment, before she softly confessed that those were exactly the words she herself was longing to hear most at this very moment. To dispel the tense atmosphere, Jae-yeon confidently raised both hands, smiling brightly as she said she just wanted to lift the burden off her chest, advising Do-young not to worry because she would handle everything on her own. But Do-young's face still bore clear signs of anxiety. She reached out as if to hold her friend back, her mind relentlessly wondering what Jae-yeon planned to do with Kwon-tae-oh and whether she could actually be of any help. Before she could find an answer, Ki-hyeon's tall figure loomed from behind, coldly reminding them both to head back since class was about to start, causing Do-young to jump in startled agreement. On the way back, cold sweat rolled down Do-young's forehead, her mind completely consumed by fear as she secretly wondered if someone as calculated and profound as Ki-hyeon would truly let this matter slide. That anxiety quickly became reality when Ki-hyeon suddenly blocked her path, standing tall with crossed arms as his piercing, deep violet eyes radiated a heavy pressure directed straight at her. Do-young's body trembled slightly, sweat drenching both sides of her temples as she cowered, utterly bewildered as to why he suddenly demanded to meet her privately in such a deserted place. Not giving her a chance to escape, Ki-hyeon suddenly leaned his face down, getting suffocatingly close, and growled directly at her with an overbearing attitude. Cornered, the young girl swallowed hard in fear, her wide black eyes filled with panic as she stammered, asking what exactly he was planning to do with her. Ki-hyeon suddenly interrogated Do-young about the private conversation between her and Jae-yeon, leaving the young girl completely frozen in shock. The young man maintained his ice-cold expression, his sharp violet eyes drilling deep into her to demand an honest answer. He silently leaned back against the stone wall, standing tall with crossed arms like a judging deity, yet radiating an incredibly overbearing pressure. At times, Ki-hyeon would slightly knit his brows in deep thought, secretly calculating his next moves in this highly tense psychological game. Recalling the moment he observed them from afar, he secretly felt annoyed that the great distance had prevented him from clearly hearing the secrets they exchanged. As for Do-young, she could only bow her head to avoid him, stammering to find a way to speak under the intense interrogation from her deep, calculating seatmate. Panic was clearly visible on her pale face. Do-young broke into a cold sweat as she realized she was being cornered with absolutely no way out. Ki-hyeon remained motionless under the setting sun, silently observing every single flaw in her expression with a gaze as sharp as a razor. A faint sadness showed clearly in Do-young's eyes. She painfully lowered her eyelashes as she felt her heart being suffocated by the terrifying silence. Finally, the young girl tightly closed her eyes in resignation, summoning the last of her strength to prepare to expose the entire truth she had been trying to hide. Summoning all her courage under the overbearing pressure, Do-young looked up slightly and honestly confessed that she was just incredibly worried about leaving Jae-yeon alone. Hearing that reason, Ki-hyeon's cold expression suddenly froze, his violet eyes momentarily flashing with a glint of surprise as if he hadn't anticipated such sincerity from her. However, He quickly regained his usual composure, slightly casting his eyes down and coldly declaring that in the end, everything was still unfolding exactly as he had anticipated. That profound, calculating attitude made Do-young jump in fright. She was secretly terrified to realize that the feelings Ki-hyeon harbored for his childhood friend were by no means as simple as they appeared on the surface. Looking at the quiet profile of the young man before her, she shuddered, realizing that this obsession was far heavier, deeper, and more intense than what people usually called love. Do-young's train of thought was abruptly interrupted when Ki-hyeon suddenly whipped around, reached out to grab her sleeve tightly, and decisively dragged her along in a completely overbearing manner. The pull was so strong that it sent the young girl stumbling. She hurriedly grabbed his hem to salvage some balance and frantically shouted for him to stop immediately. Do-young's face was drenched in sweat, her eyes wide with panic as she loudly questioned what on earth he thought he was doing in a situation like this. In response to her fear, Ki-hyeon glared back with raging bloodlust, gritting his teeth and growling that who knows what kind of depraved things that bastard Kwon-tae was doing to Jeon right this second. His erupted fury mixed with ultimate resentment. He growled in self-blame for being completely oblivious, while furiously resenting the fact that Jeon should have confided that awful matter to him instead of her. Do-young slightly lowered her eyes, explaining that Jeon hid everything simply out of fear that Ki-hyeon would lose his mind and go crazy again, just like the brawl years ago. As she stammered that Jeon only told her to prepare for the worst-case scenario, Ki-hyeon immediately whipped around, snapping and criticizing her for rambling so annoyingly. He turned back to press close, coldly exposing that Do-young was actually just afraid of getting a bad reputation herself rather than worrying about her friend's safety. Hit right where it hurt, Do-young gasped and snapped her head up, frantically denying the sharp accusation from the young man before her. Clutching her collar tightly in immense tension, she broke into a cold sweat, her mind frantically working to find a reason powerful enough to stop him. Summoning all her courage, Do-young pleaded that because he was so important, Jeon had to grit her teeth and endure it, and begged him to try looking at things from her friend's perspective. Ki-hyeon's gaze wavered slightly, those words instantly pulling him deep into the perspective of a Kim Jeon who always lived and died by her ideals of justice. Memories rushed back of the young girl standing behind her parents, a person who always forced herself to blindly carry the weight of righteousness. He bitterly realized that if anyone were to get hurt because of him, Jeon would only torment herself with guilt and permanently push him out of her life. Standing silently under the evening glow, Ki-hyeon thoughtfully admitted a heartbreaking truth. Ever since that violent incident, Jeon had completely stopped sharing her fears with him. Ki-hyeon bitterly admitted that he was extremely annoyed when Jeon chose to confide everything to a stranger, like Do-young, instead of him. Nevertheless, he tried to suppress his anger, sighing softly as he accepted reality and admitted that he had been too hot-headed just now. He coldly declared that he would personally handle the rebellious Teo smoothly, so that neither she nor Jeon would ever have to worry about hearing his name again. Do-young shuddered in terror at his violent decision, secretly fearing that Ki-hyeon was actually more impulsive and frightening than she had thought. The next day passed under a quiet atmosphere engulfing the school corridors. There was absolutely no further news or disruption since that tense conversation. Do-young walked listlessly, doubts constantly rising in her heart as to whether Ki-hyeon had truly cleaned up the trouble smoothly. Just then, she startled and stopped in her tracks when she saw the familiar figure of Teo leaning against the staff room door looking completely unusual. Suddenly, the rebellious guy whipped his head around, revealing a battered face and a murderous glare directed straight at her. Witnessing those vivid traces of violence, Do-young was terrified and quickly covered her mouth with her hands to stop herself from screaming in horror. Seeing Do-young trying to avoid him, Teo abruptly called her back in a highly suspicious tone. Being called back unexpectedly, Do-young turned around in fear and asked what he wanted, while Teo demanded to know if Jeon had revealed anything to her. Trying to suppress her panic, she pretended not to know and asked back, causing Teo to stare suspiciously at her sweat-drenched face. Realizing her clueless expression, he clicked his tongue, let it go, and muttered that if she hadn't said anything, then that was good. Right after that, he coldly announced that he was about to drop out of school and asked her to pass the message to Jeon, leaving Do-young completely frozen in astonishment. Watching Taeo's back as he decisively walked away, she wanted to call him back, but her throat was tight, unable to make a sound. In Do-young's mind, Ki-hyeon's cold promise to personally clean up this rebellious guy in the smoothest way immediately echoed. She was stunned and raised the question of whether Taeo's battered face and sudden decision to drop out were all orchestrated by Ki-hyeon's hands. Stepping closer to the window in shock, Do-young looked down and caught sight of Ki-hyeon's lonely figure standing quietly in the middle of the empty schoolyard. Her face was heavy with thought under the afternoon sunlight, trembling as she accepted the truth about a violent and scheme-filled love that the boy was practicing to protect Jaeon. While shockingly gazing at the schoolyard, Do-young jumped in fright when Ki-hyeon suddenly pressed closely right behind her back. He softly leaned into her ear to ask if that rebellious guy had left yet, causing the small girl to turn around abruptly in high alert. Responding to that confusion was a radiant yet chilling smile from Ki-hyeon as he gently called her name. Looking at his unusually bright expression, Do-young stuttered a comment that he seemed to be in extremely high spirits today. In response, Ki-hyeon proactively asked if Jaeon had received any news from that guy recently, then confidently asserted that it would never happen upon hearing her say she wasn't sure. Revealing the reason was because he was holding Taeo's phone. He shocked Do-young as she realized the phone had been smashed to pieces. Afterward, he playfully inquired if she was truly curious about the method he used to handle that rebellious guy smoothly. Looking at the smashed evidence in his hand, she could only tremble and stutter in agreement while Ki-hyeon quietly cast his eyes down to observe his trophy. Revealing the reason was because he was holding Taeo's phone. He shocked Do-young as she realized the phone had been smashed to pieces. Horrific memories rushed back of the scene where Tae screamed threats to tell Jaeon to ruin him, but Ki-hyeon only contemptuously challenged him to go ahead and mocked that it was the only backing giving him the nerve to make trouble. Ki-hyeon gripped Taeo's collar tightly, coldly warning that the guy was completely powerless under his hands. He sarcastically pointed out that there was not even a scratch on his body as evidence, and who would believe a thug's words over the exemplary image he painstakingly built. Not stopping there, Ki-hyeon's eyes flashed with a sharp coldness as he prepared to play his final trump card to crush his opponent. He exposed that he had seen all the sick things in his phone, and contemptuously asked what right Tae had to continue acting stubborn. Tae swallowed hard in fear when he heard him issue an ultimatum to obediently hand over the device and get lost in silence if he didn't want Jaeon to find out. With no way out, the thug could only humiliatingly throw the broken phone to the ground and quietly turn his back to retreat. Returning to reality, Ki-hyeon thoughtfully pondered that people like Tae might be unreasonable but were extremely afraid of having their reputation ruined, which was what she and Jaeon had been worried about for days. Looking at his calm expression at this moment, Do-young breathed a sigh of relief, secretly feeling lucky that she ultimately decided to trust and share with Ki-hyeon. Suddenly, he turned to sincerely thank her, admitting that everything being resolved smoothly was thanks to Do-young informing him in advance. Ki-hyeon's face relaxed into a warm smile, gently sending a message that from now on he would have to completely rely on her. Standing frozen in place, Do-young was stunned and dazed by the unexpected message from him. Watching Ki-hyeon's back gradually disappear around the corner of the corridor, she confusedly wondered if she had truly just been officially acknowledged by him. But immediately, Do-young vigorously shook her head, secretly warning herself absolutely not to be delusional about her own importance or get complacent ever again. Dark memories of the days of torment suddenly rushed back, suffocating her mind with a vague fear. The image of a cold, distant Ki-hyeon appeared as a cruel reminder that she was originally just a thorn in his side. Returning to reality with sorrowful eyes, Do-young bitterly told herself that from now on she must definitely know her own limits and clearly know where her position belonged. Time quickly passed. A solemn atmosphere filled the classroom as the group presentation officially began. On the podium, Jaeon confidently wore a radiant smile, clearly announcing the conclusion of Group 6's presentation. Loud rounds of applause simultaneously erupted across the classroom in enthusiastic praise from the whole class for the entire group. As soon as the assignment was finished, Jaeon could not hide her excitement, joyfully stretching and cheering because all the troubles and pressures were finally resolved. The presentation had just concluded when Jaeon happily turned to praise Do-young, making her blush and return the compliment. Riding on this wave of success, Jaeon excitedly invited Do-young to hang out to celebrate the completion of their group assignment, leaving the small girl utterly stunned. Do-young nervously glanced over at Ki-hyeon, recalling his previous warning to stay away from Jaeon. Unexpectedly, Ki-hyeon lowered his eyes and spoke up, thoughtfully interrupting the two girls. He made the excuse that his dad would worry if he came home late and suggested the two of them just go ahead and have fun, causing Jaeon to ask him again in surprise. Despite Jaeon repeatedly insisting and expressing regret because she genuinely wanted Do-young to join them, Ki-hyeon just quietly rested his chin on his hand and observed. Seeing this, Do-young gently looked up and advised him to try asking his family for permission. Faced with her innocence, Ki-hyeon suddenly tilted his head and smiled cryptically, asserting that the fun would be somewhat less interesting without her presence. His sweet words and gentle plea instantly turned Do-young to stone, her panicked mind reminding herself absolutely not to be delusional. But looking at Ki-hyeon's handsome, radiantly smiling face right now, she was completely confused, unable to understand what on earth this sudden change in his attitude meant. Standing in front of the closet with clothes scattered all over the floor, Do-young busily tried on outfits to prepare for her first hangout. Trying a dark cardigan on, the small girl anxiously wondered if this simple outfit was really okay. She was worried that her appearance looked too plain, especially since this was her first time going out alone with a friend on a weekend. Do-young told herself that if she dressed up too much, she would look like she was overly excited, just as her dad slightly pushed the door open and walked in to call her. Seeing his daughter taking unusual care of her appearance, the dad immediately panicked and questioned whether she was getting ready to meet a boy, making her startle and deny it. Do-young embarrassedly stammered, secretly flustered as she admitted to herself that the other person was indeed a boy, but things hadn't reached that level yet. Glancing at her phone screen, the small girl jumped in panic when she realized the meeting time was already approaching. Without hesitating for another second, Do-young hurriedly dashed out the door, only having enough time to yell goodbye to her dad and ask him to clean her room, leaving the dad helplessly calling after her. His precious daughter's lightning-fast departure made the dad cry tears of self-pity, while her younger brother standing nearby could only scratch his head in bewilderment, not understanding what was going on. Watching his older sister's rushed figure, the younger brother curiously asked his mom where she was going so suddenly, and the mother smiled, noting that Do-young seemed much happier since entering high school. Do-young waited nervously at the meeting spot at the foot of a building, her heart beating non-stop with anxiety. While restlessly worrying, she gave a slight start when she suddenly heard someone loudly calling her name from afar. It turned out to be Jaeon and Ki-hyeon walking over together, and her friend cheerfully asked why she had arrived so early when there were still 10 whole minutes left. Do-young unconsciously held her breath, completely frozen by Ki-hyeon's captivating handsomeness, as it was her first time seeing him in casual streetwear. She still couldn't believe she was actually having a real-life hangout with him, just as John eagerly asked where she wanted to go today. That enthusiasm made Do-young flustered, and she hurriedly waved her hands, saying she was fine with going anywhere. She shyly apologized for not knowing what people her age usually did for fun, but Jaeon brushed it off and excitedly declared that she had already planned a detailed itinerary for all three of them. And so, the group officially blended into the dense crowd on the bustling street under the beautiful weekend weather. Jaeon intimately linked arms with Do-young to lead the way, while Ki-hyeon leisurely strolled parallel right next to the two girls. Upon stopping at a fashion store, Jaeon excitedly tried on a fancy dress, making Do-young delightfully give a thumbs up in approval while he quietly stood observing from behind. The next destination on the trip was a bustling arcade that Jaeon had pre-scheduled. The three of them joined a basketball shooting game, Jaeon and Ki-hyeon happily laughing and joking around while Do-young watched them in happiness. Right after that, Jaeon excitedly pointed toward a zombie shooter arcade machine and pulled Do-young closer. Do-young and Ki-hyeon both held guns to experience the thrilling game under the enthusiastic cheering of her best friend. After exhausting moments of playing, they stopped by a fancy restaurant together with a dining table fully laid out with appetizing dishes. Jaeon excitedly used her phone to take a picture of the lavish feast to preserve the memorable moment of the three. A moment later, Do-young quietly picked up her phone, intently observing the screen with thoughtful eyes. On the screen was a close-up photo of the delicious-looking dishes they had just shared together. But the point that caught her attention the most was the moment Ki-hyeon's hands accidentally made it into the frame while picking up food. Gazing at that small yet priceless moment, a feeling of warmth and indescribably sweet happiness suddenly swelled up in Do-young's heart. At the restaurant, Jae-yeon happily posed for a photo with a dining table, while Ki-hyeon sat beside her, smiling gently as he looked at her. He gently reached out to tease his best friend, his expression radiant and overflowing with a doting affection reserved only for her. Do-young looked at the photo on her phone, unable to hide a glowing, happy smile at this tiny memory. The photo had captured the moment all three hands playfully posed next to the plate of food, a testament to a friendship that was gradually blossoming. On the way, Do-young hugged her phone tightly while smiling, her heart filled with an unprecedented sweet and warm feeling. Her train of thought was suddenly interrupted when she heard Jae-yeon loudly call her name from up ahead. Her best friend was excitedly pointing at a souvenir shop, asking the whole group to stop by because there were many cute items. As soon as they walked inside, Jae-yeon excitedly suggested buying matching keychains, making Ki-hyeon curiously ask which type she wanted to choose. She happily held up a pretty pink bear keychain and spared no praise for its adorableness. Ki-hyeon immediately offered gently to buy it as a gift for his best friend, while Do-young stood dejectedly in a corner, her hand tightly gripping a heart-shaped keychain with envy and self-pity surging in her heart. Drowning in self-pity, Do-young was startled when Ki-hyeon suddenly turned to ask her what she was doing in that corner. He gently told her to bring the keychain she was choosing closer, causing Jae-yeon beside them to ask again in surprise. Ki-hyeon proactively suggested that all three of them use a matching group keychain set, leaving Do-young stunned as she told herself not to hope for too much. Looking at his gentle smile, she wondered in confusion why he was suddenly being so nice to her and whether it was only because of Jae-yeon's presence there. But she immediately recalled the moment the two of them were alone in the gym, when his gentle expression back then didn't seem to be fate. Nevertheless, she forced herself to wake up from the dream, reminding herself of her promise to absolutely never come between the two of them. In her insecurity, Do-young thought that a timid and pathetic person like herself was ultimately just a troublesome existence, standing in the way of his happiness. Yet, amid the darkness of that insecurity, a faint glimmer of hope suddenly flashed in the small girl's mind. Looking at the matching keychain resting in the palm of her hand, she wavered slightly and wondered if she had the right to harbor hope. Cherishing the bright red heart symbol in her hand, Do-young blushed in embarrassment, harboring a tiny wish of whether she could truly become his friend. While they were strolling along the street together, the atmosphere was suddenly shattered by a phone ringing repeatedly. Ki-hyeon quietly pulled out his phone to check it, his face instantly hardening into a cold, soulless expression. Seeing his strange attitude, Jae-yeon walked beside him and curiously asked what was wrong and who was calling. He coldly replied that it was his dad, and there was no need to answer, startling Do-young behind him at the mention of that man. In her mind, memories immediately surfaced of the famous actor Seo Kang-suk, the notorious father in his family tragedy. The phone in Ki-hyeon's hand continued to vibrate violently, plunging all three of them into a suffocating silence. Unable to leave it be, Jae-yeon advised him that this might be an emergency call and that he should probably answer it. Ki-hyeon sighed helplessly, asking the two girls to wait for him for a moment even though they knew full well he didn't want to pick up. He quietly walked to a remote, secluded corner to prepare to face the high-pressure call. The moment the call connected, Ki-hyeon immediately received a blunt and cold command from his father, forcing him to go buy alcohol for him. On the other end of the line, his father violently insulted him with the worst words, demanding to know where he was loitering. Wearily, Ki-hyeon reminded him that he was still a minor, but his father coldly brushed it off, using the excuse that he had bought alcohol many times before. Threatened that everything in the house would be smashed to pieces if he didn't bring the alcohol back immediately, Ki-hyeon lowered his eyes, only able to sigh helplessly in bitterness. Returning to reality, he turned back to tell them both that he had to go home urgently, just as Jae-yeon also had to go back to prepare dinner for her grandmother. As they were about to say goodbye to head their separate ways, Ki-hyeon suddenly called out to stop Do-young. He gently requested that she walk with Jae-yeon to ensure she got home safely, because he had an urgent matter to handle. Worried about her friend's safety after the trouble with Teo, Do-young immediately agreed to see her friend home, causing Ki-hyeon to thank her in relief. Along the way, Jae-yeon walked closely beside her new friend, curiously asking if she lived near this area. Do-young embarrassedly lied that she was just on her way to buy some things nearby, and Jae-yeon cheerfully accepted the reason. Suddenly, Jae-yeon smiled knowingly and remarked that Ki-hyeon seemed to genuinely like her, making Do-young panic, widen her eyes, and stutter a denial. Jae-yeon sincerely asserted that she wasn't joking at all, as she had been best friends with Ki-hyeon for a very long time. She revealed a shocking truth that she had never seen Ki-hyeon treat anyone else with such kindness or special gentleness besides her. Despite Do-young shyly arguing that he was naturally kind to everyone, Jae-yeon thoughtfully admitted that she might have phrased it a bit wrong. She gently shook her keychain while explaining that what she meant was, when it came to treating someone like family and truly opening up, Do-young was the first person to achieve that. Jae-yeon emphasized that such small acts of care were things Ki-hyeon had previously done only for her, with absolutely no precedent for anyone else. Her best friend's firm assertion left Do-young completely flustered, a hard-to-describe fluttering feeling subtly rising in her heart. She told herself that Jae-yeon was definitely the person who understood him best, just as a motorcycle came speeding up dangerously from behind. The roar of the engine right next to her startled Do-young in a panic, leaving her completely disoriented by the sudden situation. Detecting the imminent danger, Jae-yeon screamed a warning for her friend to quickly get out of the way. In a split second of life and death, Jae-yeon did not hesitate to lunge straight forward, tightly hugging Do-young and pulling her hard away from the vehicle's fatal impact. Jae-yeon held Do-young tightly in a protective embrace, shielding her from the near-miss collision. After a sharp swerve, the motorcycle lost control, crashed, and slid across the cold concrete road surface. Do-young sat on the ground in shock, her trembling voice repeatedly calling Jae-yeon's name in utter terror. Her tears poured down as she witnessed the horrific scene before her eyes, her inner self screaming prayers for her friend's safety. The sunset sky gradually fell, dyeing the corner of the street a brilliant red like an omen for a catastrophic tragedy that had just struck. Meanwhile, Ki-hyeon wearily carried the bag of alcohol back, sighing in frustration because he had to walk a very long distance just to find a place that didn't check IDs. While completely immersed in complex and confusing thoughts about Do-young, the phone in his hand suddenly vibrated, interrupting his train of thought. Looking down at the screen, Ki-hyeon was extremely surprised to see the incoming call displaying Chae Do-young's name. He quickly answered the call in puzzlement, completely unaware of the storm that was about to hit. In just an instant, Ki-hyeon's eyes suddenly widened in horror as the panicked sounds from the other end echoed back, shattering his last bit of composure. Receiving the terrible news over the phone, the bag of alcohol in Ki-hyeon's hand dropped to the ground, shattering completely just like his mood at that moment. He uttered a question in hopeless shock, his purple eyes filled with bewilderment at the horrific information about Jae-yeon's accident. The hospital scene appeared under a sorrowful evening sky, where a battle to reclaim the poor girl's life was taking place. Do-young stood lonely in front of the hospital lobby, her tiny figure enveloped by an unceasing sense of guilt and regret. The small girl bit her nails in extreme anxiety, sweat breaking out as she thought about the critical condition of her only friend. Do-young's eyes trembled with fear when she saw a familiar figure frantically rushing toward her from a distance. Ki-hyeon ran like mad to the meeting spot, his face drenched in sweat and his breath ragged from worrying too much about his loved one's safety. The moment he saw Do-young, he lost control, rushing forward to grab her shoulders tightly and screaming to demand why she could be so terribly useless. His bursting rage turned into gloomy self-reproach for making such a mistake in trusting Jae-yeon to someone who couldn't even protect others like her. He gritted his teeth and barked at her for wasting time calling him instead of calling 119 emergency services, leaving Do-young to only tremble, burst into tears, and utter apologies in despair. Ki-hyeon callously shoved Do-young aside, coldly snapping at her to get out of the way so he could immediately go see Jeon. Left behind alone in the hallway, Do-young stood frozen in the darkness, painfully blaming herself for being too afraid. The sunset faded over the distant mountains, signaling that a long day full of heartbreaking events was drawing to a close. Night quickly enveloped the space, returning a terrifying silence to the empty hospital grounds. Do-young remained standing motionless in the same spot for hours, her tiny figure dwarfed by the cold stone wall. While dazed in hopelessness, she startled slightly and looked up when she heard someone calling her name, breaking the silence. It turned out to be her dad and younger brother who had frantically rushed over to find her. Her dad worried because the family had arrived way too late compared to the scheduled time. He hurriedly checked his daughter all over, anxiously asking if she was injured or if any misfortune had happened to her. Faced with her family's care, Do-young could only cast her eyes down in deep sorrow, her heart heavy as she thought about her friend's catastrophic accident. Trying to suppress the brokenness inside, the small girl forced a faint smile and softly reassured her dad that she was completely fine.